Spider-Man: Homecoming stars the third live-action Spider-Man since 2002, and that barely even begins to scratch the surface of how many Spider-Men have appeared on screen over the years.
誰だお前は! 地獄からの使者、スパイダーマン!
So, how do they stack up? Here's a look at the major versions of Spider-Man from TV and movies, and the actors who played them, ranked from worst to best. 70s live-action Spider-Man. It isn't actor Nicholas Hammond's fault that nobody remembers the short-lived Amazing Spider-Man TV show from the late 1970s. He just didn't have that much to work with. There were no supervillains, no supporting cast from the comics except J. Jonah Jameson and a single appearance by Aunt May, and Hammond never looked, talked, or moved like anything other than a random guy you'd run into at Comic-Con. Spider-Man Unlimited. Spider-Man Unlimited was basically an effort to extend the 90s animated series past its sell-by date by sending Spider-Man to an alternate Earth. Voice actor Reno Romano just did his best impression of Christopher Daniel Barnes, who preceded him in the role.
Great! Not only am I carting around my worst nightmare, it's leaking!
The costume, derived from the Spider-Man 2099 comics, is memorable, but it probably would have worked even better if they'd just made a Spider-Man 2099 cartoon. 60s animated Spider-Man. Considering Spider-Man had only existed for 4 years when this show started, relatively few viewers had a clear idea of just what Spider-Man should be like. Paul Soles as Spider-Man sounds the way 1960s cartoon viewers expected a superhero to sound, which means he sounds exactly like Superman.
I once swore never to turn my back on anyone, and I'm not starting now.
This Spider-Man is best remembered today as the star of many animated GIFs and memes, and of course for its awesome theme song. 1981 Animated Spider-Man. The 1981 Spider-Man animated series wasn't bad by any means. The animation was solid for the time, and it brought in a lot of spider villains from the comics who'd never gotten TV time before. The weirdest thing about this show is that it was immediately overshadowed by another Spider-Man cartoon, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, which premiered the same day. The two series also used the same character designs, which kinda made this series feel like a run of Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, in which he has no friends and talks a little funny, thanks to the vocal talents of Ted Schwartz.
Oh no! I'm gonna miss my lunch date with Betty.
The Electric Company. Spider-Man's first live-action appearance, interestingly enough, was on The Electric Company, a 1970s educational series that ran on PBS. This Spider-Man, played by Danny Segrin, didn't talk, but his simple adventures were the perfect vehicle for teaching kids basic language and math skills. But the highlight of the show? The narration, which was provided by a pre-fame Morgan Freeman.
And he's found it. A rubber glove sandwich.
Spider-Man, the new animated series. Two things are distracting about 2003's Spider-Man, the new animated series. The first is the combo 2D and 3D animation. The second is that every time Spider-Man talks, you can't help but hear Neil Patrick Harris.
This is so not spandex!
Not that Harris is a bad choice for Spider-Man, but come on, isn't he more suited for villainy? Japanese Spider-Man. The 1978 Japanese Spider-Man live-action TV series has a cult following in the US, even though it's never been officially released there. In this version, Spider-Man is a motorcycle driver who gets his spider powers from a super bracelet from the planet Spider. The show's a lot of fun, and the actors do a great job. But it just feels wrong to rank them any higher when they're not playing the same Spider-Man as everybody else. 2000s Spider-Man movies. In the early days of 21st century superhero movies, Tobey Maguire got the job done. He got in great physical shape for Spider-Man, but he still had the softness to play nerdy Peter Parker.
Punch me, I bleed.
While he never quite seemed like a kid in the way an origin story Spider-Man should, he was still young enough to be believable as a teenager, making him a solid version of the web-slinger. Ultimate Spider-Man. Disney's first animated Spider-Man series after it purchased Marvel, some of the production decisions for Ultimate Spider-Man didn't sit well with longtime fans. especially the decision to hire Drake Bell of Drake and Josh to voice the title character.
You don't know how that feels.
I do, actually. Someone important was taken from me, too.
But if you look past the bad buzz, Bell is actually a pretty great animated Spider-Man, and he also comes through in the darker moments that require a more emotional Peter Parker. Amazing Spider-Man. The biggest problem with Andrew Garfield as Peter Parker is that he was already too old for the part when he starred in The Amazing Spider-Man. He never seems like an awkward teen, and yet the rebooted franchise offered another origin story set in high school. Still, his slim build looked good in the suit, and his comic timing made him a natural fit for the rhythms of the character's constant wisecracks.
Knock it off, man! No!
90s animated Spider-Man. For a lot of millennials, Christopher Daniel Barnes was the definitive voice of Spider-Man throughout their childhood. While this Spider-Man has aged a little awkwardly, it was the first TV version of the character to really draw on the comic storylines in a nuanced way, introducing concepts like the Venom suit, the Secret Wars crossover, and even Daredevil. This series skipped the origin and began with Peter Parker already in college. Within that context, Barnes is perfect in the part, balancing the jokes and emotional baggage that are both so central to Spider-Man.
Spider sense! Danger!
Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. For those a little older, Dan Gilvezan was the Saturday morning Spider-Man of choice. He voiced the central hero on Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends from 1981 until 1986. His Spider-Man had the lightness that earlier versions of the character had been missing, while still seeming more grounded than the goofier Iceman.
Oh, no! Oh, yes!
This cartoon seems pretty silly by today's standards, but this was the first time Spider-Man really seemed like Spider-Man, and that's worth something. The Spectacular Spider-Man. Spectacular Spider-Man was basically the perfect Spider-Man cartoon, and one that ended too soon. It ran for 2 seasons in 2008 and 2009, and was being considered for a third when Disney bought Marvel and reacquired the television rights to Spider-Man, leaving this Sony-produced series unable to continue. Voice actor Josh Keaton played the youthful Spider-Man with the earnestness of a kid trying to do his best, and it really worked. It's just a shame there couldn't be more of it.
Yoo-hoo! Excuse me, can I come in this way, or do I have to break my own window?
Spider-Man!
MCU Spider-Man. As the third live-action Spidey in under a decade, Tom Holland may finally be the perfect choice. He comes across like a young teenager with a surprising amount of power, and his youthfulness stands out perfectly in contrast with all the adult heroes running around in the MCU.
Are you an Avenger?
Yeah, basically.
Spider-Man Homecoming presents him as a nerdy high school student who might be in way over his head. And that's exactly what Spider-Man should be, especially within the context of a larger Avengers-centric setting.
If you're even slightly a fan of Spider-Man, you're in for a treat with Sony's new animated movie. There's enough hidden away inside the film to keep surprising viewers on their second, third, or even fourth watches. Here are just a few of the Easter eggs you might have missed in Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. While Spider-Verse is ultimately an origin story for Miles Morales, the spotlight does get shared with other Spider people. The first hero audiences are introduced to is the Peter Parker of Miles' universe. The movie starts off with this Peter's narration, catching viewers up on the broad strokes of the Spider-Man story. During Peter's recounting of his exploits as a superhero, the movie revisits several classic set pieces from the Sam Raimi Spider movies, including Spider-Man's heroic train rescue, the time Dr. Octopus threw a car through a window, and the much-derided sequence of an evil Peter Parker strutting around in Spider-Man 3 shooting everyone some finger guns.
So good.
Everyone knows that Marvel loves those classic Stan Lee cameos, but some of the shoutouts to other important artists from the company's history can often be harder to notice. Spider-Verse provides a bit of a call-out for 2 other figures who were crucial to Spider-Man's development. When Miles is on the train shortly after discovering his powers, he pulls out his phone and scrolls through the contacts, passing by a conspicuous entry for B. Bendis, a reference to Brian Michael Bendis, who co-created Miles with artist Sarah Pichelli in 2011. Later, in a similar moment with Jefferson, Jeff scrolls by an entry for Steve Ditko, who co-created the original Spider-Man with Stan Lee in 1962. Though Miles is Brooklyn-born and raised, he also seems to be a fan of the Chicago-based MC Chance the Rapper, with a poster for his mixtape coloring book appearing in Miles' room. Amusingly, the distinctive baseball cap Chance wears on the real-life cover, with a number 3 on it indicating that the mixtape is his 3rd release, has been changed in Miles' alternate universe to the number 4. The implication is that the Chance of this universe is slightly more prolific than the version we know. Maybe Miles' universe just put a lot more emphasis on the Lil B collaboration. We all know that Spider-Man is more than just a character. He's a lucrative multimedia property, and Into the Spider-Verse has fun with that fact. Part of Peter Parker's intro to the movie focuses on the extensive library of Spider merch that's been created over the course of his crime-fighting career, with one of the most amusing products being the Spider-Man Christmas album. But this isn't a joke that was made for the movie, it's actually a joke from real life. The album in the movie is a reference to a real Spider-Man album that was released in 1975, a rock opera from the label Lifesong Records called Spider-Man: Rock Reflections of a Hero. It sounds like Jefferson Airplane singing jaunty songs about how no one's got a crush on Peter Parker. It's kind of awesome. And in some alternate universe, it's probably a chart-topping hit. There have been so many Spider-Man suit designs over the years at this point that you could spend days putting together a list of your favorites. Into the Spider-Verse showcases a number of alternate costumes inside of Aunt May's secret spider lair. Several of the suits visible in the background are culled from Spidey's long comic book history, and also show up in the Spider-Man PS4 game, particularly the advanced suit with the white logo that was made just for the game. You can also spot suits reminiscent of the black and green stealth Big Time suit, the Electro-proof suit, the black suit from Secret War, and even a look similar to the Black Dust suit. And the most humorous suit, which features a clunky-looking superhero cape, originally appeared in Marvel Comics' What If, number 19, published in 1980.
I think this is a cape. Whoa.
At separate points in the movie, both Peter Parker and Miles Morales take a break from their crime fighting on the head of a panther-esque gargoyle, jutting off the side of some New York City architecture. Peter has some coffee and reads the newspaper, while Miles strikes a pose highly reminiscent of another superhero, T'Challa himself, the Black Panther. The movie features imagery that originally appeared on a poster for the Black Panther movie released during the 2017 San Diego Comic-Con. In that image, T'Challa can be seen in his full Black Panther suit, looking out over the horizon under soft lighting as he flexes his glutes for the camera. Do you think Miles' dimension has its own Marvel Cinematic Universe? Miles' police officer father, Jefferson Davis, presents himself as a guy who likes law and order. So what better way to indicate his allegiances than with a reference to the TV show Law and Order? In the beginning of the movie, Miles gets a ride to the Vision's boarding school on his first day from Jefferson in his police car. The license plate for Jeff's car is RFD 960, which is actually a reference to the detective's vehicles in the original Law & Order series, which always featured the same license plate through the show's entire run. Just like in real life, there's a lot going on in Spider-Verse's Times Square. One billboard in the neighborhood is an advertisement for a Broadway show called Hi Hello, which is actually reference to some other work from a member of the movie's cast. The advertisement is a take on the real-life show Oh Hello on Broadway, which starred comedians Nick Kroll and John Mulaney. Mulaney, of course, is a part of the Spider-Verse movie as the voice actor of Peter Porker, the spectacular Spider-Ham.
I'm right here.
Shortly after all of the Spider people converge, they meet for a pep talk inside of Miles' dorm room, which he shares with a roommate. When the roommate returns unexpectedly, they all dart up to the ceiling, shuffling around the corners to avoid being seen while the roommate reads from a comic book. You may notice that the comic book refers to a story called Imagine That There Was More Than One Spider-Man. Imagine that indeed. While Marvel Comics never put out an Imagine That line of comics, the company does have a series called What If. This speculative line of comics, published since 1977, usually focuses on weird one-off stories, allowing writers and readers to explore wild hypothetical scenarios such as what if Spider-Man had joined the Fantastic Four? Of course, something just like that actually happened many years later, so clearly the idea was pretty good. The post-credit scene for Spider-Verse thrillingly introduces one of the best and coolest Spider people, Miguel O'Hara, aka Spider-Man 2099. At first, it seems as though the Stinger will be setting up a futuristic Spider-Verse sequel, but that notion quickly sails out the window when Miguel travels to the goofy alternate universe of Earth 67. In Marvel Comics canon, this world is the home of the cornball 1967 Spider-Man cartoon, and the sequence quickly becomes a big joke. When Miguel arrives, he immediately encounters the 67 Spider-Man, after which they proceed to recreate the Spider-Man pointing at Spider-Man meme for what feels like a full minute. And then the movie ends. It's arguably the weirdest, funniest post-credit scene in a genre that is full of them, and the perfect way to send off this silly love letter of a movie.
Is No Way Home the most emotionally devastating Spider-Man film to date? No doubt about it. Keep watching for a rundown of the film's most emotional moments. Major spoilers ahead. Many fan theories about Spider-Man No Way Home proved to be accurate, especially that Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield would appear. From the time they arrive, Maguire and Garfield serve as mentors to Tom Holland's Peter Parker, teaching him that they've also experienced immense losses. Fortunately, they'll be by his side when it comes to fighting off the remaining villains and curing them of their various ailments. As expected, they save the day, but sadly, it's at a high cost. Holland's Spider-Man asks Doctor Strange, played by Benedict Cumberbatch, to make the universe forget about him. That means everyone he's ever known will forget about his existence. So before Strange performs the spell, Peter Parker goes to say goodbye to those who helped him, starting with the other Spider-Men. It's a heart-wrenching moment because it's at this point we know it's quite possibly the last time we'll see the 3 live-action Spider-Men share the screen. There's always a chance they could return in a future installment, but that's far from a sure thing at this point. For now, it's just goodbye. After months of speculation that all 3 of them would share the screen together, it actually happened, and just as quickly as it was confirmed, it went away. Saying goodbye to the other Spider-Men is tough for audiences to watch, but what comes next is far more devastating. After all, the MCU's Peter Parker has only known these other heroes for a few hours. Meanwhile, he's been friends with Ned for years and dated MJ for a brief but still meaningful period of time. But as a result of Doctor Strange's spell, his 2 best friends will ultimately forget about him. It's far more emotional than what Peter originally wanted to happen when he asked Strange for help. At the beginning of the film, Peter merely asks the sorcerer to make everyone forget that he's Spider-Man. He still could have been with MJ, but she wouldn't have known about his secret identity. With this new spell, which is necessary to prevent forces from other dimensions from entering their world, she has to forget about Peter entirely. Peter hugs Ned goodbye and kisses MJ, knowing this is the last time they'll know about one another. He has to say goodbye to the best thing that happened to him in recent memory, and he struggles to part with her. Near the end of Spider-Man No Way Home, MJ insists that Peter find her after Doctor Strange performs his spell. Peter then goes to the coffee shop where she works, complete with a prepared speech about his feelings for her. Admittedly, it's a strange way to go about telling someone something monumental. Peter's plan basically hinges on telling MJ, who doesn't recognize him at this point, that he loves her. We're betting that no amount of reminiscing would allow her to recall who Peter Parker is, either. However, it's how this scene unfolds that's genuinely gut-wrenching to witness. Peter is prepared to tell MJ who he is, but he notices a wound on her forehead. He doesn't say it, but we, as the audience, can tell what he's thinking. He knows that if he tells MJ he's Spider-Man and continues dating her, he'll only put her in more danger. After all, she almost died when she fell off the side of the new Statue of Liberty. Peter recognizes the best thing for MJ is not to know who he is, so he takes his coffee and walks away. It's a scene that embodies everything about the mythos of Spider-Man. He frequently has to cast aside what he wants for himself and do what is good for the rest of the world. There's a significant moment more than halfway through Spider-Man No Way Home. Tom Holland's Peter loses someone close to him, and as a result, he's hesitant to carry on his mission of curing the villains before sending them back to their realities. He talks about a person he loved who lost their life as a result of his actions, and both Maguire and Garfield are there to tell him that he's not alone.
I can't save everyone.
Holland's character tries to tell them they don't know what he's going through, but little does he know they have experienced all of the same things. Garfield's Spider-Man tells the story of how he failed to catch Gwen Stacy during a climactic battle, as seen at the end of The Amazing Spider-Man 2. He then describes how his failure caused him to act more violently, to the point that he barely recognized himself. Maguire's Peter Parker then shares the story of his Uncle Ben's murder. He recalls how he went down a path of revenge, tracking down the man responsible and killing him. To be Peter Parker is to have gone through unimaginable pain. These heartbreaking stories give Holland's Spider-Man the courage necessary to continue with his plan to save the villains rather than outright killing them. The MCU Spider-Man films made the decision not to show the death of Uncle Ben on screen. It's alluded to at various points, leaving fans to believe that in doing so, the franchise would simply skip over Ben's whole "with great power comes great responsibility" speech right before his dramatic death. This isn't necessarily the case, thanks to one pivotal Aunt May scene. When the villains decide to ambush Tom Holland's Spider-Man, they really put him through the ringer. The fight concludes with the Green Goblin throwing one of his signature pumpkin bombs at Peter and Aunt May. Peter goes to make sure his aunt is all right. When he tells her he wants to abandon the plan, Aunt May reminds him that with great power, there must also come great responsibility. It's heartbreaking because the audience can guess what's going to happen next. Aunt May's injuries are too severe and she dies in Peter's arms. He can't stay there to properly grieve because the police are on his tail, believing he's the one responsible for all of the damage. He runs into the night with his biggest supporter no longer there.
In the early 1990s, director James Cameron convinced Carol Co. Pictures, which produced movies such as Terminator 2, Total Recall, and Rambo, to option the film rights to Spider-Man. But Cameron's production was ultimately tangled in an inescapable web. Why couldn't one of Hollywood's most powerful directors get this film made?
Oh no. No!
Too edgy. Cameron's plans for Spider-Man have become a Hollywood legend. According to Rebecca Keegan's book, The Futurist, The Life and Films of James Cameron, Spidey creator Stan Lee absolutely loved Cameron's treatment. Ultimately, many of Cameron's own ideas, like Spidey's organic web shooters and Uncle Ben's carjacking death, made it into the Sam Raimi-directed Spider-Man movie from 2002. But for every one of Cameron's good ideas, there were at least 3 that were not. Cameron called for Peter to curse like a sailor, which would have resulted in an R rating. And then there was a scene where Peter peeped in Mary Jane's window as she dressed, and one where Spidey and MJ get intimate on the Brooklyn Bridge while Peter describes the creepy ways spiders mate. What? Low budget. Cameron would have likely made Spider-Man right after Terminator 2, which had a $100 million budget. According to Janet Wasko's How Hollywood Works, Carol Co. only committed to a $50 million budget, a huge step backwards for him. And if the reported budgets of his next 2 films, $100 million for True Lies and a record-setting $200 million for Titanic, tell us anything, that Spidey's balance sheet wasn't going to fly. Bad casting. Rumor has it that Cameron wanted to cast Arnold Schwarzenegger as Dr. Octopus. Schwarzenegger even hinted at his involvement in an interview with Empire, only going so far as to vaguely say that the studio went in another direction. There are yet more rumors and reports of Cameron's dream cast for the film, and one of them is a pretty strange choice. Edward Furlong, whose big break came as John Connor in Cameron's Terminator 2, was reportedly the director's pick for Peter Parker, and Leonardo DiCaprio was to play Harry Osborn. Of course, Leo wouldn't play second fiddle to just anyone. Johnny Depp, for sure. Eddie Furlong, not a chance. The report also pegs Drew Barrymore as Gwen Stacy, and J. Jonah Jameson would have been played by R. Lee Ermey, the drill sergeant in Full Metal Jacket.
You will not laugh. You will not cry. You will learn by the numbers. I will teach you.
That would have been perfect, but it wouldn't have been enough to make up for tanking the principal cast. Litigation. While the script, casting, and budget issues all could have become later stumbling blocks, what ultimately squashed Cameron's Spider-Man were legal issues. Cameron told Collider that when Carol Co. collapsed a few years after they acquired the rights to Spider-Man, he already had Titanic in his sights. Moreover, he no longer wanted to pursue Spider-Man because of all the competing interests for the rights amid Carol Co.'s bankruptcy, and Marvel's. Apparently, a number of former writers and producers all claimed to have had a hand in developing the project, and they all came calling. Marvel's own 1996 bankruptcy process scattered multiple holding deals to the wind. According to How Hollywood Works, after Marvel recovered from bankruptcy, they basically paid off everyone who was trying to sue for the rights to Spider-Man, which freed them up to sell the rights to Sony. Meanwhile, Cameron turned one of the greatest human tragedies of all time into a billion-dollar smash, so he did just fine.
I'm the king of the world!
All of the Spider-Man films tend to feature the same elements over and over again. While a lot of it's worked well for the character for about 60 years, you could go to the theater and play Spidey Bingo pretty easily. Here are things that we see in every single Spider-Man movie. Let's start with a gimme here. If you have a nephew or niece and you find out they've been bitten by a radioactive spider and developed fantastic abilities like sticking to walls or super strength, pack your bags and get out of town as fast as you can. Otherwise, you're headed for disaster. Admittedly, the death of his uncle is the most important part of Spider-Man's origin story, but still, watching an old man get shot starts to lose its impact when you've seen it over and over, which is especially problematic in the Sam Raimi Spider-Man trilogy. We get Uncle Ben's murder happening in the first film, a flashback and tons of references to it in Spider-Man 2, and a completely different version of it that involves the sad sack movie version of the Sandman making up a huge chunk of the plot of Spider-Man 3.
Remember Ben Parker? The old man you shot down in cold blood?
It should probably be noted that this particular brand of tragedy isn't limited to Ben. In Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, Miles Morales watches as his own uncle is killed in front of him. As for the MCU, those movies have managed to avoid even a mention of the late Ben Parker so far, with only a couple of oblique references to Peter's defining tragedy. Far From Home, however, is going to take place in the aftermath of Tony Stark's death. He's not Peter's uncle by relation, but he's definitely served as a father figure. And if there was ever someone in Peter's life who fit the weird uncle archetype, it's that guy.
Hey, May. How you doing? What are you wearing? Something skimpy, I hope.
One of the most interesting choices in Spider-Man's design is that he's one of the few American superheroes whose costume leaves him completely covered from head to toe. His mask doesn't even have a mouth, just a pair of big opaque eyes. This works pretty well in comics, but in movies where actors use their faces to, act, it presents a bit of a problem. That's probably why the Spider-Man we see in the movie theater seems like he'll do whatever he can to get out of that mask, regardless of how it impacts his secret identity. Again, the Raimi trilogy is the biggest offender in this regard. Not only does Peter's mask get shredded by villains with a frequency that makes you wonder just how many spares he has laying around, he'll occasionally just whip the whole thing off. Sure, it's a lot easier to tell a character's struggling when you can see their face, but eventually, people are going to wonder why that kid who's always taking pictures of Spider-Man never seems to catch him without his mask on.
We won't tell nobody.
Along the same lines, Homecoming features a recreation of the famous comic book scene where Spidey fights his way out from underneath tons of rubble. In the comic, the mask stays on, but on the big screen, Tom Holland's Spidey takes his mask off to get some fresh air and keeps it off so that we can see him powering through his superheroic feat of strength. Andrew Garfield's Peter Parker shows off his face in Amazing Spider-Man to help calm down a boy who's in danger. It even extends to animated acting in Into the Spider-Verse, where Spidey loses his mask just before he's killed by the Kingpin. And Peter B spends most of the movie unmasked and in sweatpants. There are very few things that superhero movies love as much as a good old-fashioned dose of crucifixion imagery. You might recall the scene in Man of Steel, for instance, where our hero's ghostly space father tells the son he sent to Earth that he can save everyone, prompting Superman to stick his arms out and start hovering in a pose that's pretty familiar to anyone who's ever been inside a church. While that's the least subtle example of this trope, Spider-Man's movies have even more of it in action. That's probably to be expected in a story of great power and great responsibility, but once you start noticing it, you'll find it happens a lot. Spidey stopping the train in Spider-Man 2 is the most obvious instance, but when Peter tries to hold the ferry together in Homecoming, we get the same thing in a pretty similar shot. Spider-Man 3 even has an entire sequence that takes place in a church, finally adding parasitic alien symbiotes to classic biblical imagery. Into the Spider-Verse actually manages to parody the movie's crucifixation twice in the first 2 minutes, including a shot showing a Spidey bathed in rays of sunlight that give him just a tiny bit of a halo. One of the most compelling parts of Spider-Man's story is the impact that his superheroic career has on his soap opera of a love life. It's the source of endless drama, and it usually gets pretty complicated. The same goes for the movies. Every single Spider-Man film has a love story right there at the core of its plot, with all the twists and turns that you'd expect. In the Raimi films, it was Peter's on-again, off-again relationship with Mary Jane Watson, which started out complicated and only gets more tangled as the films continue, especially when Gwen Stacy shows up in Spider-Man 3. In Amazing Spider-Man, Gwen was free of a love triangle, but that relationship had no shortage of speed bumps. In the first film, Gwen's dad wanted to arrest Spider-Man for his vigilante activity.
I think he stands for what you stand for, sir. Protecting innocent people from bad guys.
I stand for law and order, son. That's what I stand for, okay? I wear a badge. This guy wears a mask.
And in the second, a series of spats wound up leading to Gwen's tragic death. Homecoming threw a different kind of wrench into the gears with Peter's crush on classmate Liz. Not only did he have to deal with constantly letting his friends down due to his arachnid activities, he also had to contend with the reveal that her dad was a supervillain, who figured out Peter was Spider-Man literally 10 minutes after meeting him.
Good old Spider-Man.
Into the Spider-Verse complicates matters further thanks to its dimension-hopping plot. We've got a Peter Parker who's dealing with a divorce from Mary Jane, with whom he's clearly still in love, and a different Mary Jane who's dealing with the death of her world's Peter Parker. And those are just the minor characters. The main romantic tension in that movie is between two people from different realities. That's a tough one. There's long-distance relationships, and then there's my girlfriend? You don't know her. She lives on Earth 65. Spider-Man's roster of enemies is packed with characters who are actually pretty sympathetic. Unlike, say, murderous clowns that only want to watch the world burn, supervillains like the Lizard and the Sandman have motivations that we can relate to, and come with a heaping helping of pathos that the movies are more than willing to bring to the screen. The Green Goblin in Spider-Man is the outlier here, since it's pretty hard to be sympathetic when you're pumpkin bombing an old lady's bedroom while she's saying her bedtime prayers.
Deliver us!
Finish it! Finish it!
Then again, even he has a scene where Norman Osborn is being tormented by his own alternate personality. Doc Ock in Spider-Man 2 is shown to be a pretty decent guy before he's driven to multi-armed criminal insanity. And in Amazing Spider-Man, Kurt Connors the Lizard just wants to regrow his lost arm. The Vulture in Homecoming is maybe the least sympathetic guy of the bunch.
I'll kill you and everybody you love.
For all his talk about sticking up for the little guy, Adrian Toomes drives a Jaguar and owns a massive house in New York City, bought and paid for with the profits from his high-tech arms dealing business. But still, his stated motivation of wanting to take care of his family is hard to argue with, and if nothing else, he keeps Peter's identity a secret rather than seeking revenge. Into the Spider-Verse goes the furthest with this. Not only do we see the Prowler as a regular guy hanging out with his favorite nephew, but even the Kingpin has a shred of sympathy in there. Yes, he kills Spider-Man with his bare hands and had a plan that might have destroyed all of reality, but it all comes from his desire to see his wife and son again. Their methods are bad, but their desires are very human, and pretty far from world domination. In his first appearance, Spider-Man didn't start out with his familiar spider suit. Instead, his first outing after getting his powers was in a pretty terrible homemade ensemble, and that's an idea that the movies have kept around. There's always a bad costume first. In Spider-Man, it was a recreation of a scene from the original comic where he fought a pro wrestler while wearing a sweatsuit and ski mask tricked out with a stenciled spider on the chest. In Amazing Spider-Man, it was a red mask with dark wraparound shades. The MCU actually flipped the script a little by starting Peter off, at least as far as the audience is concerned, in a comics-accurate version of his famous red and blue suit, provided by Tony Stark. It's only at the end of Homecoming that he goes back to his homemade hoodie. Into the Spider-Verse, however, takes the cake on this particular trope, with bad costumes all over the place. Not only does Peter spend most of the movie rocking sweatpants and mismatched shoes, but Miles Morales doesn't get his costume until the very end. Before that, most of his spidery adventures take place while he's wearing a cheap Spider-Man Halloween costume, purchased of course from smiling Stan Lee. No refunds. Incidentally, these are all just bad costumes. If you're looking for the evil costumes, well, that's a different guy.
Outstanding.
Spider-Man's life is pretty much defined by tragedy. It's the core of his character, the hard luck hero aspect that makes him so easy to relate to. But if the movies go back to that well all the time, it gets both boring and a little too depressing. As much as we like watching him get knocked down, it's always better to see him get back up again. That's why the movies always show us something to remind us that being Spider-Man is actually kind of awesome, and more than a little fun.
After everything, I still love being Spider-Man. I mean, who wouldn't?
Spider-Verse gives us all kinds of moments like this, from Spider-Man cutting an album of Christmas carols to the extended comedy of Miles accidentally getting his hand stuck to Gwen Stacy's hair. Throw in some Karate Kid-style web-swinging lessons, and it does a great job of showing us that having superpowers is actually pretty cool. The Raimi movies do it too, leaning into zany comedy with Peter zipping around the city on his web lines to deliver pizza. He even looks like he's having fun with that dance number, even if no one else is. Amazing Spider-Man 2 takes that to the next level, with Spidey getting to his graduation through a series of wild rides and slapstick crime-fighting hijinks. It's Homecoming that does this best, though, with a montage of Peter's after-school activities as the friendly neighborhood superhero. Not only is he excited to get out there and start doing good, he gets a churro from a nice lady that he eats while hanging out on a fire escape, and even does a backflip when he's asked to by members of the public. That's what sets Spider-Man apart from the other superheroes. He's the guy who will stop and argue with you about who makes the best sandwich.
Yeah, the best sandwich in Queens.
Subhaven's pretty good.
Well, it's too much bread.
I like bread.
One line in the Hawkeye series referenced a big event in Spider-Man No Way Home, and even if you've been keeping up, you still might have missed it. Here are the other big Easter eggs only real fans noticed in Spider-Man No Way Home. Spider-Man No Way Home goes to some dark places, but there's a lot of joy and humor in the movie's more creative moments, especially all the parts where universes collide. Jamie Foxx's revamped version of Electro is arguably the funniest character in the whole film. Even though they're from different universes, his Max Dillon strikes up an amusing relationship with Thomas Hayden Church's Sandman. During the movie, they both realize their superpowers were given to them via some kind of horrible accident. Flint Marko fell into a particle accelerator, while Dillon fell into a pool of genetically engineered electric eels. As Electro says to Sandman, looking back on their mutual mishaps, "You gotta be careful where you fall." Another one of the movie's fun referential lines comes from star high school reporter Betty Brandt. Newly aware of Peter Parker's dual life, she remarks at one point, "Go get him, Tiger," or should I say, Spider.
Tigers, it's been a long, dramatic, somewhat confusing road.
The line is fun for a couple of reasons. First of all, it makes sense on its own because Peter's school mascot at the Midtown school happens to be the Tigers. That itself would seem to be a bit of a reference to a classic catchphrase of Mary Jane Watson.
Go get him, Tiger.
Of course, Kirsten Dunst's delivery of the line was itself paying homage to Mary Jane Watson in the comics, who has been fond of the pet name Tiger since her first appearance in the 1960s. Mary Jane herself may never quite appear in the MCU Spider-Man movies, Betty paying homage to MJ Classic's fave pet name. Another intriguing one-liner reference in No Way Home occurs when Peter is brought into an interrogation-like situation following his exposure as Spider-Man. While trying to defend himself, Peter Parker says that Nick Fury could vouch for his heroic actions, but he's promptly told that Nick Fury has been off-planet for the last year. What? In case you've not been keeping up, between the events of the last Avengers films and Spider-Man Far From Home, it was established that Nick Fury has been off on a most mysterious adventure somewhere in outer space. When Nick Fury returned from his disappearance during the blip, he attended Tony Stark's funeral, and then apparently arranged to have the Skrulls Talos and Soren impersonate him and Maria Hill. We don't know the exact reason why yet, but the arrangement seems to be in place so that he, or possibly he and Maria both, can take a long work trip/vacation in outer space. The scenario was teased explicitly in a post-credits scene for Spider-Man Far From Home, showing Nick Fury looking surprisingly comfortable during his mission aboard a Skrull spaceship. Whatever he's doing out there, his own personal Star Trek seems likely to be wrapping up soon, with the timing to coincide with the upcoming Secret Invasion series on Disney+, which will reportedly shine a light on the shape-shifting Skrulls' mysterious activities on planet Earth. One No Way Home Easter egg isn't even in the movie itself, so you definitely shouldn't feel bad if you missed this one.
Hi!
In the 5th episode of the Disney Plus series Hawkeye, the new Black Widow, Yelena Belova, talks about being in New York City for the first time. She makes a reference to wanting to visit various landmarks, including the new and improved Statue of Liberty.
I want to see the Empire State Building, the new and improved Statue of Liberty, and the Rockefeller Center.
In the Hawkeye series, this comment doesn't quite make sense, but when you see No Way Home, it all starts to fit together. In the movie, we see that the Statue of Liberty is under construction to replace its torch with Captain America's shield, and the scene plays host to the movie's climactic final battle. Since small indications like Christmas music and decorations seem to pinpoint No Way Home as taking place in December, and the Hawkeye series explicitly takes place near Christmas, it seems like Hawkeye and No Way Home are set fairly close to each other in the series' continuity. Arguably, the most entertaining scenes in No Way Home have nothing to do with car-wrecking highway confrontations or Statue of Liberty smackdowns. The real fun happens during a handful of quiet moments when Spidey and his two new Spider-Man pals, played by Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire, compare notes on their three somewhat similar but often distinct universes. Both Maguire's Peter and Holland's Peter have an MJ. Garfield does not. Holland and Maguire have both fought aliens. Garfield has not. But perhaps the most enjoyable bit of shop talk is the trio's discussion of Tobey Maguire's organic web shooters, which you might recall became a hugely controversial issue in those simpler days back in 2002, when Hollywood saw superhero movies as more of a box office gamble. At the time, director Sam Raimi essentially said it made more sense that someone bitten by a radioactive spider, taking on the qualities of a spider, would be able to shoot webs biologically. It seemed to make more sense, he reasoned, than having Peter coincidentally possess the scientific and engineering acumen to invent web shooters. These days, audiences are used to Peter Parker's web shooters being built by somebody, as in the comics. That makes it all the more entertaining to hear the questions the other two Spider-Men have for Maguire's Peter Parker. Does he ever get the web equivalent of writer's block? Do any other parts of his body shoot web fluid?
Those wings carbon fiber?
Is this stuff coming out of you?
The three Spider-Men in No Way Home essentially represent Peter Parker at various stages in his life. Holland is the naive, earnest youngster, Garfield the jaded, heartbroken loner, and Maguire, still apparently in a relationship with Mary Jane, has learned how to balance it all and find some semblance of happiness. One of the most memorable, powerful moments from the Spider-Man franchise came in 2014's The Amazing Spider-Man 2, when an imperiled Gwen Stacy fell from a high distance as Peter grappled with a villain. Desperately trying to save her, Peter shot a web, but it was too late. This tragic death of Gwen Stacy, of course, mirrored one of the most famous moments in comic book history. Another memorable moment in the franchise came in 2002's Spider-Man, when Willem Dafoe's Norman Osborn attempted to use the blades of his Green Goblin glider to impale Maguire's Peter Parker from behind. Leaping out of the way at the last moment, Spidey lived to see another day, but Osborn was killed. In No Way Home, Maguire is the Spider-Man who steps in when Holland's Peter Parker gives into his rage and is about to similarly kill Osborn with the Goblin glider. Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man, meanwhile, has a powerful moment coming to Holland's aid when MJ falls from the Statue of Liberty. This time, in a powerful moment, rather than watching another love of Peter Parker's life die, the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man is able to successfully shoot a web and save her. When Peter's secret identity gets outed, he and his friends are detained early in the film by Damage Control, a Men in Black-like government agency that seems adjacent to S.H.I.E.L.D. They appear to be primarily interested in issues of concealment and public relations. While this isn't the first time MCU fans have seen Damage Control, it's possibly the most substantial. Mentions of Damage Control go all the way back to the original Iron Man film, and they're referenced on an episode of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.
S.H.I.E.L.D. will take all the wounded men into custody, and Damage Control will clean up.
In Spider-Man Homecoming, the agency fired Adrian Toomes, aka the Vulture, from engaging in his private scrap operation. Instead, they took over the cleanup of sensitive materials in NYC and set events in motion that would lead to much of that film's plot. In 2015, Marvel announced that the Damage Control organization was going to be the subject of a comedy on ABC. Obviously, the series never made it to air, and it seems quite likely that many of those ideas have begun seeping their way into MCU storylines, like what we see in No Way Home. But none of this is all that new for fans of Marvel Comics, who have been encountering Damage Control since 1988 and saw the organization play a substantial role in the Civil War comics. Multiple Spider-Men are swell, but you can be forgiven if the cameo that excites you most in No Way Home comes at the beginning of the film, when Peter finds himself in legal hot water. Happy and Aunt May sit him down with none other than Matt Murdock, played once again by Marvel fan favorite Charlie Cox.
That's it. Let the devil out.
Marvel Studios president Kevin Feige recently told Cinema Blend, "If you were to see Daredevil in upcoming things, Charlie Cox, yes, would be the actor playing Daredevil. Where we see that, how we see that, when we see that, remains to be seen." Well, it didn't take long. This is exciting because it's the first substantial crossover we've seen between the MCU and the Netflix live-action TV shows. And since Daredevil ended its run on Netflix, many fans had started to think it would never happen. Seeing Cox in No Way Home, at the same time that Vincent D'Onofrio made his first appearance as Kingpin in the 5th episode of Hawkeye, makes for a thrilling time in MCU Phase 4. Taken together, it's confirmation that Feige and Marvel Studios mean business when it comes to bringing at least some of the Netflix characters back into the MCU.
So the devil is back.
There aren't many superhero roles that match up to Spider-Man in terms of cultural impact. Countless hopefuls have auditioned for the part of Peter Parker in his various incarnations over the years, including some of the biggest and most unexpected names in Hollywood. We'll never know what might have happened if one of these guys had been cast as Spidey, but it's fun to wonder. Here's a look at some actors who were almost cast as Spider-Man. Heath Ledger. Heath Ledger will forever be remembered for his game-changing performance as the Joker in Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight. But the late actor could have wound up on the good guy's side if Sony had gotten his way. In the wake of his death, Ledger's former agent Steve Alexander revealed that his client was the studio's #1 choice when it came to casting the lead in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. The actor was ultimately put off by how little he knew about the character, telling his agent he would have been taking somebody else's dream away if he took the part without fully appreciating Spider-Man's history. Jake Gyllenhaal. Of course, the part of Raimi's Peter Parker ultimately went to Tobey Maguire, and the rest is Spidey history. Maguire was propelled to A-list stardom after the first film stormed to the top of the domestic box office in 2003, but he almost never made it to the second movie after sustaining a back injury while filming Seabiscuit in 2003. Jake Gyllenhaal was drafted to take his place, though he was dropped when Maguire made a miraculous recovery just in time for shooting. It isn't the only time Gyllenhaal has narrowly missed out on playing an iconic superhero. He was also close to playing Christopher Nolan's Batman, only to be beaten to the role by Christian Bale.
I'm Batman.
James Franco. It's not uncommon for an actor to come away from an audition having failed to get the part that they went for, only to be contacted and offered another role in the picture. This was the case with James Franco, who read for the lead role in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man but was ultimately beaten to the prize by Tobey Maguire.
Oh, look at little Goblin Jr. Gonna cry?
Franco confessed that he was disappointed when the director called him to let him know the part had gone to Maguire, though he softened the blow when he instead offered the Freaks and Geeks star the part of Harry Osborn, son of the Green Goblin and Peter Parker's best friend. Franco agreed, and the casting call for Harry was immediately withdrawn. Daniel Radcliffe. When Tom Holland was announced as the newest Spider-Man, Harry Potter star Daniel Radcliffe was among those who offered public congratulations to Holland, but his compliments may have come through gritted teeth. Radcliffe went on to reveal that he wanted the part himself, while also conceding that it was now out of reach. I would have made a good Spider-Man, but the boat has sailed on that one. I'm not sure if I'd sign up for something that was another 7 or 8 films or 10 years, but a shorter franchise, yeah. He did get to at least live out his dream by cosplaying a Spider-Man for Comic-Con though, so that's nice.
You know, you don't go to Comic-Con without going down on the floor and seeing it all. And so the way I came up with doing that was Spider-Man.
Leonardo DiCaprio. Just because we didn't get a big-budget Spider-Man until 2002, that doesn't mean there wasn't earlier attempts. One of the big what-ifs in superhero movies is the James Cameron version of Spider-Man, which the acclaimed director abandoned in favor of Titanic. Among the stars Cameron considered for the lead role was none other than Leonardo DiCaprio, who read the screenplay and met with Cameron to discuss the role. DiCaprio never did get to don those tighty Spideys, but Cameron gave him a pretty good consolation prize, the lead role in Titanic. And that's not even the earliest try at a cinematic Spidey. Tom Cruise. After several failed attempts to negotiate a deal to get Spider-Man swinging onto the big screen in the late 70s and 80s, Marvel finally signed on a dotted line with Cannon Films, a production company known for churning out low-budget action films. Texas Chainsaw Massacre director Tobe Hooper was signed up to direct a script that actually saw Peter Parker mutate into an anthropomorphic tarantula. Tom Cruise was offered the part, opposite Bob Hoskins as iconic Spidey villain Dr. Octopus. But, unsurprisingly, Cruise decided to pass on the bizarre project. But wait, it gets even weirder. Michael Jackson. In 2009, Marvel's legendary Stan Lee told bewildered audiences at San Diego Comic-Con that Michael Jackson had once invited him to his Neverland Ranch to ask about personally producing a Spider-Man movie, with the late King of Pop intending to take on the starring role himself. When Marvel said no, Jackson came up with a new plan: buy Marvel out so he could play the role.
When I told him I didn't think the company would sell it, he then wanted to buy Marvel. He said, well, then I'll buy Marvel. I don't know what happened. I mean, obviously he didn't buy Marvel, but he wanted to very much.
Yikes.
My hearing senses are tingling.
When teenage nerd Peter Parker is bitten by a radioactive spider, he gains a weird selection of arachnid powers and spends the rest of his days balancing vigilante crime fighting against leading a normal life. Except it's never really been that simple for our friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, and his history has so many twists and turns that it's not easy to keep track of his tangled web. A true original? In 1954, Halloween costume manufacturer Ben Cooper, Inc. began selling a Spider-Man outfit. The kid-sized duds were little more than a yellow ensemble covered with drawings of webs and the word Spider-Man written across the forehead, giving the overall impression of, well, a poorly dressed idiot who'd recently escaped from a basement or something. Years later, Marvel's Spider-Man made his debut in 1962's Amazing Fantasy number 15, the final issue of a doomed anthology series. While Cooper's earlier Spider-Man may seem like a huge coincidence, the case is complicated by rumors that Jack Kirby, the original artist for Spider-Man before Steve Ditko took over, was working for Ben Cooper at the time. Comic site Newsarama explored the case and got a terse reply from Ditko, and silence from Marvel, which definitely sets our spider senses tingling. Spider Origins Redux. Artist Jack Kirby had his hands in the creation of just about every major comic character you've ever heard of. While the first appearance of Spider-Man was written by Stan Lee and drawn by Steve Ditko, Lee originally had Kirby draw the first 5 pages of Spidey's debut. The pages didn't hit the mark and were scrapped. For the final version, Lee's original plot and Kirby's costume designs were changed, and Kirby ultimately only drew the cover of Amazing Fantasy number 15. Unfortunately, this didn't stop Kirby's heirs from trying to claim payment for Marvel's use of Spider-Man in 2009. Even Lee, Kirby's everlasting partner in Mighty Marvel creativity, denied the Kirby family's claim. According to Deadline, the suit was settled on undisclosed terms in 2014, which is even more suspicious than Norman Osborn's crazy cornrows. 20 Ingram Street. Over the course of 1989's Amazing Spider-Man numbers 316 and 317, readers were shown two halves of a change of address form filled out by Peter Parker, and only curious readers who assembled them saw that the Parkers were now living at 20 Ingram Street in Forest Hills, New York. Whether or not this was an Easter egg planted by writer David Michelinie or artist Todd McFarlane is unknown, but as of 1974, there really was a family named Parker at that address, who soon began receiving mail addressed to the fictional Peter. When the New York Times explained the story in 2002, they also discovered that 19 Ingram Street was home to a family named Osborn, just one letter off from Spider-Man's arch-nemesis, Norman Osborn. Back in Black. When he's not wearing his red and blue duds, Spider-Man is known for wearing a stealthy and slimming black, which he found in an alien vending machine during 1984's Secret Wars miniseries, and decided to slap on his body. What readers might not know is that the black costume wasn't an original idea from Marvel, but one sent in by a fan for a contest in 1982. While Randy Schuler's costume idea apparently involved underarm webbing, which didn't make it into the sketch, and a red logo, the similarities to the official black suit remain. Schuler was paid for his idea, $220, which would be about $550 today. Schuler's other ideas would later be incorporated into additional Spidey costume ideas. Unstable Molecules and Thought Control were both used by Spidey's Future Foundation and Iron Spider costumes respectively. But Schuler was never given any actual credit, according to his own post on Comic Book Resources. Center of the Web. Comics fans might not think about it much, but Spider-Man is the absolute center of the Marvel multiverse. Even though heroes like Captain America and Iron Man get top billing, there are more versions of Spider-Man across the multiverse than any other hero. And anytime we visit another reality, Spider-Man is so iconic and consistent that he's always there, and generally used as a compass to differentiate the different planes of existence. While the main Marvel continuity, Earth 616, has its own fair share of the Spideys, there are literally hundreds of alternates, including Spider-Ham of Earth 8311, the Flaming Skull-Headed Ghost Spider of Earth 11638, and a whole lot of dead Spider-Men, since Peter seems to get caught in the old bug zapper of life pretty often. The cruelest revenge. Spider-Man has probably had the roughest life of any superhero. He doesn't have Batman's wealth, and he doesn't have Superman's strength, but he accomplishes pretty much the same heroic stuff. But the very worst thing that ever happened to Spider-Man was being cheated on by his girlfriend, Gwen Stacy, with his arch-nemesis, Norman Osborn, aka the Green Goblin. While this was never spoken of during Gwen's life, the 1999 storyline Sins Past revealed the ultimate betrayal. Gwen had kept her terrible goblin baby secret, and because of their unique DNA, they aged rapidly and came after Peter Parker because that's what goblins do. Everyone, Peter Parker and comic readers included, hated the whole thing. Spider magic. Everyone knows that Spider-Man's powers are purely scientific in nature, because being bit by a radioactive animal automatically transfers its powers to you. And that's just basic biology. Except in 2001, the arrival of a character named Ezekiel revealed that Spidey's superhuman abilities were actually kinda magic, and that fateful radioactive spider bit Peter Parker on purpose because of cosmic mystical machinations. It's a bit like the midichlorians of the Marvel Universe, but it also kinda explains why most of Spidey's bad guys are animal-themed. Deal with the devil. The apex of weird Spider-Man storylines is Peter Parker's deal with the devil, Mephisto. In exchange for the survival of his dear, decrepit, nearly deceased anyway, Aunt May, Spidey would give up his marriage and future kids with Mary Jane, forcing him straight back into the friend zone. Spidey's reason for taking this deal? Peter's Aunt May was hovering between life and death because she'd been put in danger after he revealed his secret identity during Civil War, and he'd come to the sensible conclusion that taking off his mask in front of the world had been a big mistake. In return for Peter sacrificing his life with Mary Jane, Mephisto made the world forget he was Spider-Man, thus protecting his loved ones from the line of supervillain fire. Crossover madness. Spidey is a guy who gets around in some pretty weird places. In 1978, Peter and Mary Jane attend a taping of Saturday Night Live, and a mix-up between villain Silver Samurai and John Belushi's samurai character causes an issue-long ruckus featuring the entire 1978 SNL cast. In 1993, Marvel had the rights to publish a comic series based on Ren and Stimpy, so Spider-Man ended up battling Powdered Toast Man in those pages, and getting one punch through a wall by the bread-headed hero. And in 2009, Spider-Man rescues none other than Barack Obama from the chameleon, who decides to impersonate the president-elect moments before the inauguration. And that's truly only the tip of the weird bird. So many spiders! At one point in Marvel's history, Spider-Man was so popular that he starred in 4 books at once, making it nearly impossible to keep track of his adventures or even take a nap. All of it came to a head when Norman Osborn framed Spider-Man for murder, forcing Parker to drop his heroic persona and take on a different heroic mantle, or 4. As Hornet and Prodigy, Peter continued his heroics, and as Dusk and Ricochet, he was able to infiltrate New York's criminal underworld to find the real murderer. Spidey was able to drop his alternate identities, but they were later taken up by a group called the Slingers, who were quickly beaten by the New Warriors in a game of basketball and pretty much never seen again. Mary Jane is not my lover. At some point during the 1990s, pop star Michael Jackson made moves to try and purchase Marvel Comics, only because he wanted to play a heroic character when it came time to make some Marvel movies. It was revealed in 2011 that Jackson petitioned X-Men's producers for the role of Professor X, for reasons that are now a complete mystery to all humanity. But Stan Lee's recollection was different. In their personal conversations, Jackson revealed to Lee that he really wanted to play Spider-Man, though Tobey Maguire eventually got the role, probably saving the Marvel movie universe as we know it. Trailer trashed. Speaking of the original 2002 Spider-Man, the film's original theatrical trailer had to be completely pulled and scrapped after the events of 9/11. Due to the fact that the entire thing hinged upon a helicopter being caught on a web between the Twin Towers. Since the terrorist attacks happened after much of filming was completed, but before the film's theatrical release, the towers were cut from a handful of scenes. The replacement trailer featured Spider-Man perching on an American flag instead. Spandex sadness. Spider-Man's many portrayers have all had very different reactions to the tights. Civil War's Spider-Man, Tom Holland, had costumes that were designed for his stunt double, so when he put them on, they were a bit too baggy, bumming out Holland during his first time in the suit, according to Comic Book Movie. Tobey Maguire was pretty uncomfortable until the costume designers put in a bathroom portal. And despite bathroom breaks being a known problem for spider actors, the costume department again forgot to include a vital flap for Andrew Garfield, who only had the addition put in during his second outing as the character. Still, Garfield admitted during a radio interview that he was so taken by the fact that he got to play the iconic hero that he cried when he first put on the suit. And we thought Tobey was the Spidey who cried, "Turn off the dart." Spider-Man's films aren't the only times he's been made into a live-action hero. In 2010, director Julie Taymor brought Spidey to Broadway in a play so fraught with problems that it quickly became an unintentional comedy of errors, even with music by the members of U2. By opening day, the production had already cost $65 million, and not even Disney, who had recently purchased Marvel, had any interest in helping out. A disturbing number of actors and extras were injured during production due to the show's complex stunts, and at one point, Green Goblin became stuck on a wire over the audience, hanging there for a few minutes before the show could begin again. Not even the Clone Saga was this embarrassing. Spiders Sentai. Broadway wasn't the only place to suffer from a misguided live-action Spider-Man. In 1978, Japanese production company Toei took note of Spidey's tight costume and likened him to their own skin-tight tokusatsu heroes, like Kamen Rider. Japan's Spider-Man was given an origin not unlike DC's Green Lantern, when he's given a fancy device and powers by an alien from the planet Spider, who he finds in a crashed UFO called Marveler. In true Japan form, Spidey also gets a transforming robot, which he uses to fight against Professor Monster. The show ran for 41 episodes, all with Marvel's approval, and with amazing episode titles like Becoming Splendid, To the Murderous Machine of Transformation, and The Onion Silver Mask and the Boys Detective Group. Spider-Man-imation. In 1992, Marvel and Saban had a huge hit with their X-Men animated series, so Marvel decided to build on this success by debuting Spider-Man in 1994. While Spidey series was also an action figure spawning phenomenon, it was subject to completely absurd censorship. While it's reasonable to request that a kid's cartoon omit animated blood, it made less sense to forbid even the mention of blood, even in an episode where Morbius, the living vampire, appears and can no longer be called a vampire. Other rules included no breaking glass, no punching, except in limited circumstances, and no use of the word sinister. This last one is especially odd, as Spidey's main villain collective is known as the Sinister Six, and Mr. Sinister was over on X-Men being evil on the regular. Sorry kids, basic English vocabulary is too rough for your little pudding brains and bloodless bodies. Say no to bugs. Because Spidey is pretty much an everyday average guy, he's been used countless times as a tool for educational purposes, from direct-to-VHS shorts about child abuse to full comic arcs about the dangers of drugs. When the US government approached Stan Lee to write an anti-drug story in 1971, he was all for it, as long as it was a good story. Strangely enough, this was during a time when the Comics Code Authority also expressly forbade any mention of drugs whatsoever. After the story was shot down by the Comics Code, Lee made the difficult decision to publish it anyway. It was so well received that the CCA changed its own code, opening up comics to a much wider range of educational stories. Oh baby. Spidey's strangest foray into educational materials was definitely The Pull of the Prodigy, a 1976 story written by Anne Robinson for Planned Parenthood. In an amazingly surreal plot, the alien villain called Prodigy, no relation to Spider-Man's previously mentioned alter ego, uses the powers of alien persuasion to try to convince teenagers to make babies, so that he'll have tons of minions to do his bidding. Part of the Prodigy's propaganda was to straight up say that diseases weren't possible and getting down in the backseat of a Chevy didn't really cause pregnancies. Of course, Spidey laments how tough his life is even without a Rugrat, and defeats the Prodigy before it's too late. If anyone was poised to lecture kids about celibacy, it was definitely nerdy Peter Parker.
With so many Spider-Man movies out there, there are a lot of Spider-Man villains. We're taking a look back at the many supervillains that Spidey's battled against. Beware, some gigantic spoilers ahead. Stop the video now if you're not up to date on every Spider movie. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is, even more than Spider-Man 3 before it, an overstuffed movie that banks on interconnectivity to help drive excitement for a sequel that ultimately never came. At the time, Sony Pictures was attempting to push ahead with its own cinematic universe with Spider-Man at the heart. When it didn't work, we ended up with Spider-Man in the MCU. Watching The Amazing Spider-Man 2 today is mostly an amusing exercise in seeing someone try to build a universe that never quite comes together. Rhino is, sadly, a victim of this crumbling effort. The film had Paul Giamatti playing a Russian gangster in a mechanical rhino suit, and the actor clearly relished chewing up as much scenery as he possibly could in the role. Sadly, he only appears in a couple of scenes. He might have had more to do with a hypothetical sequel, but here he's largely an example of a wasted opportunity. The version of Green Goblin who shows up in The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is a perfect example of the film pushing ahead for universe building while sacrificing any real sense of long-term storytelling. We've never met this version of Harry Osborn before, but we're told he's got a connection to Peter going back years. We haven't seen the toll his genetic illness is taking on him, but we're told it's bad and we should care. We haven't seen any real development in terms of Green Goblin tech, but we're shown it all packaged and ready for Harry to dive in. It's a whole lot of telling without any emotional weight. This lack of real investment makes this the most forgettable version of Green Goblin on the big screen so far. Making Electro the primary villain of The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was a good idea on paper. He's got cool powers that can manifest themselves in interesting ways visually, and he was played by Jamie Foxx, who offered up a new version of the character. Unfortunately, it doesn't quite work. Fox seemed to do the best he could with the material he had, but the character's motivations get lost in the shuffle of everything else the film is trying to do. By the time Electro is somehow actually playing music with his powers at the end of the film, he's lost any goodwill he had before.
I hate this song!
Venom is a complicated character, and introducing him into any film as a Spider-Man antagonist has the potential to be very tricky business. The way Spider-Man 3 does it works fine as a catalyst for the film's climax, but doesn't really let audiences get to know this particular version of the villain and how he works. There's no time to dig into what the relationship to the symbiote is, or exactly why Eddie Brock gives in so quickly, or if there's any real humanity left in him. This version of Venom is pretty much just a fight scene, and that's a shame. Spider-Man: Homecoming, the first solo Spider-Man adventure in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is a great example of a film that knows how to juggle multiple villains without overwhelming the piece. While Vulture does the heavy lifting as the film's chief bad guy, his crew back at headquarters fits into the story in an organic and entertaining way. However, the Tinkerer doesn't rank higher on this list because he doesn't have that much to do in the film. He's the guy in the chair, manipulating tech and communications behind the scenes while the Vulture does the fighting. Because of that, he's not a heavy hitter within the film, but he's certainly entertaining in the space he's given. Homecoming manages to breathe real life into him by making him a nosy, strange guy who's just happy to have a gig where he can be a huge tech nerd.
What did I tell you about looking at my phone?
Oh, sorry, you left it out. You know I'm a curious person by nature.
The economy of storytelling in Homecoming is so great that the film manages to fit in not one, but two versions of the Shocker. In the film, he's an employee of the Vulture who's gifted with gauntlets that emit tremendous energy when they make contact with someone or something. It's enough to make the character stand out in his few fight scenes. The first Shocker relishes the idea that he can have a self-given code name and go around punching things with his new toys.
You're out there wearing that goofy thing, lighting up cars, calling yourself the Shocker. I'm the Shocker. I shock people. What is this, pro wrestling? Whatever, old man.
When the second Shocker gets a hold of the gauntlets, things become much more businesslike, and the deliberate, calculated way in which he tries to pick apart Peter Parker is actually rather chilling. Together, they present a portrait of a minor supervillain that adds plenty to the film while never getting in the way of Vulture's spotlight. The Amazing Spider-Man wisely started its new Spidey universe by picking a villain who'd only been hinted at in the Sam Raimi films in the form of a supporting character. We'd seen Dr. Kirk Connors before, but we'd never seen him transformed into a monster by his own scientific hubris and desperation. The fact that the character was in the Raimi films created a sense of excitement among fans who were finally going to get to see the Lizard, while never quite feeling like the new film was retracing the steps of the old ones. In The Amazing Spider-Man, Dr. Connors takes on a certain kind of quiet strangeness that permeates the early scenes. You get the sense that he's a man who's thought far too much about things he probably shouldn't be tinkering with. As his slow transformation begins, the character becomes even stranger, creating a villain who's both threatening and sympathetic. The decision to make the Sandman a major villain in Spider-Man 3 is an interesting one, particularly when you consider all the other things the film is trying to do with Peter Parker's emotional journey. The decision to make him the guy who killed Uncle Ben off-screen in the first film complicates this in ways that neither the film nor the Spider-Man mythos really need. Despite this version of the Sandman works because of the parallels the film draws between him and Peter. They're both men with strange powers they didn't ask for, pushed into darkness by circumstances beyond their control, and hoping to atone for their past mistakes. Thomas Hayden Church plays the character with real heart, and his final scene is one of the most powerful moments in a flawed film.
I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just want you to understand.
Spider-Man 3 could have been a film entirely about the rise of a second Green Goblin in parallel to Peter Parker wrestling with the Venom symbiote, and it would have still been a jam-packed movie. As it is, we got a film that attempted to juggle 3 different villains and cram them all together into a final fight scene. So Harry Osborn's final journey in the Spider-Man trilogy gets crammed in too. Still, Harry's decision to become the second Green Goblin in an effort to avenge his father and then to seek heroic redemption is a rewarding one. It doesn't always work, particularly when Harry has to turn on a dime between hero and villain in various scenes, but the 2 preceding films add emotional weight to a weaker script. Willem Dafoe is having so much fun in the role of Green Goblin, years before character actors would begin competing for supervillain roles left and right, that his sense of instant joy at being immersed in the comic book world is infectious. Dafoe has to transform into full supervillain mode almost instantly, and somehow he brings it to life flawlessly.
What do you want?
To say what you won't, to do what you can't.
He does so even in spite of the film's shortcomings in its treatment of the character, something that's particularly obvious in the costume design. The decision to forego an expressive face for the character and instead feature a fang-bearing mask might have made sense in 2002. Unfortunately, watching the film today, it makes the scenes with Spider-Man and the Goblin look a bit too much like action figures yelling at each other. Even in those moments, though, Dafoe's voice carries the performance. If you didn't watch the intro, this is where the big spoilers happen, so turn back now. Spider-Man Far From Home had to follow a lot of different very tough acts, just one of which was Michael Keaton's performance as the Vulture. The decision to make the next villain Mysterio, another newcomer to live-action Spider-Man, was a welcome one. Even better, fans seem to immediately support Jake Gyllenhaal's casting as Mysterio, a guy who creates illusions to disguise his true intentions. Gyllenhaal gets a lot of meaty stuff to play with in the film, from the idea that he first presents himself as a hero from another dimension, to the revelation that he's a scorned former employee of Tony Stark. The early, more heroic scenes work great, but the turn is where Gyllenhaal really shines. Once the gloves are off and he's in full supervillain mode, he's having the time of his life, and so are we. He doesn't quite rise to the heights of the very best live-action Spider-Man villains, but he's very close. So much so that even after Far From Home, you can't help but feel hungry for more of him. With a few notable exceptions, Sam Raimi's Spider-Man films are often defined by their aesthetic and structural devotion to the Marvel Comics book they're based on. The key to the best of these films is the way in which they know exactly how to deviate and when. With Spider-Man 2, we get the best of both worlds in Dr. Octopus. He's a guy who looks and moves exactly how we'd expect the comic book version to move, and he has the added gravitas of a good man corrupted by his own creation. Alfred Molina is flawless as Dr. Octo Octavius, a scientist who's hoping to change the world before his brain is infected by the artificial intelligence in his robotic extra arms after a horrible accident. Riddled with guilt and grief, Molina plays the disintegration of the character perfectly, then manages to guide him back to redemption with the same sense of vulnerability and delicate emotional resonance. It's a great performance in a great comic book movie. Sometimes Spider-Man stories are at their very best when they take a very simple, easy-to-follow metaphor and translate it into the big, bold strokes of a superhero story. Spider-Man Homecoming is a story about Peter Parker finding out his girlfriend's dad is a jerk, and the jerk is played to perfection by Michael Keaton. There's so much to love about the Vulture in Homecoming, from the look of the character to the way Keaton plays him as a working-class guy who got tired of being pushed around. There's no nonsense here, but there are tricky emotional turns to make, and Keaton manages them all by being equal parts charming and terrifying. The scene in which he has a private moment with Peter in his car is among the best moments in any Spider-Man film.
Hey, I just saved your life. Now what do you say?
Thank you.
Even better, the fact that his character actually has a point about the way regular people are pushed down in an increasingly strange world only adds to his impact. It's a brilliant, layered performance that's going to be hard to top.
Why do people keep making movies about a guy who shoots webs out of his wrists? Because they're fun, and that's not just true for the audience. The people making them seem to be having a blast too. Here are some times when things got a little silly on set. In Spider-Man Homecoming, Tom Holland's Peter Parker has a full and busy life. In addition to superheroics, he's got to juggle homework with a spot on his school's academic team, not to mention working as an intern at Stark Industries. In one scene, he tries to talk his way out of an upcoming academic decathlon, and his advisor won't take no for an answer. Peter sputters off a list of his responsibilities, and it turns out that responsibilities is something of a trigger word. It's the crux of a Spider-Man mantra after all. When he flubs a line, he can't help but break character, give a right turn to the camera, and recite the phrase predecessor Tobey Maguire made mainstream.
Stark and my internship, I got a lot of responsibility with it. With great power comes great responsibility.
When Spider-Man 2 opens, Peter Parker has already endured a lot of Spider-Man. He's in college at this point, but still the same clumsy guy in public, picking up none of the gracefulness of his superhero side. In one scene, Peter drops all of his books and school supplies while walking on campus. That was supposed to happen. What came as a surprise to Tobey Maguire was what happened next. As he stays in character, grumbling and picking up his things as other students walk by, one faceless extra slams a backpack into Maguire's head and catches a strap on his neck. This blooper is actually a prank, courtesy of director Sam Raimi. He's the guy with the backpack, surprising Maguire and making him laugh. While Spider-Man isn't as loaded as Batman or powerful as Superman, he does have one big thing in common with them. He's an orphan. Those other guys were raised by a butler and some kindly farmers, while Spider-Man grew into a goofy and friendly teen thanks to his Aunt May and Uncle Ben. In a rapid-fire barrage of bloopers from the set of Spider-Man Homecoming, Ned, played by Jacob Batalon, and Peter try to talk to Liz about the current teen party scene, and Peter mentions how parents sometimes let their kids throw those parties. That bit of dialogue sends Holland off the rails. He remembers that his character doesn't exactly have biological parents anymore.
They let you have parties, My parents They're dead.
A quiet, heartfelt moment with the object of your affection can make even the most confident person into a tongue-tied mess. But hey, sometimes deep thoughts and feelings are better left unsaid, right? That would make one Spider-Man 2 blooper extremely realistic, except Tobey Maguire isn't supposed to be so wordlessly flummoxed in a cute romantic scene with Kirsten Dunst, who's playing Mary Jane Watson.
Hi.
To his credit, he sells that mistake as simply being overwhelmed by emotion, but then he realizes he's been silent for way too long and that the jig is up. Part of what makes Spider-Man such a great character are the differences between the bold superhero and his mild-mannered alter ego. Spider-Man is Peter Parker, of course, but they're also total opposites, at least to the casual observer. For example, Spider-Man glides through the air with the greatest of ease. Peter Parker, on the other hand, is a gangly and timid teen who's not quite comfortable in his own skin. In Spider-Man Homecoming, the actor meant to embody both Peter and Spider-Man really nailed Peter Parker's awkwardness. Tom Holland is almost too deep in character. The actor apparently tripped, slipped, and stumbled quite a lot during the making of the movie. Maybe Tobey Maguire feels uncomfortable doing romantic scenes in action-heavy superhero movies, or maybe he doesn't think the idea of introducing the comics character Gwen Stacy is necessary for the already overstuffed Spider-Man 3, which already had so many characters, or maybe the actor has just gone a little stir-crazy from playing Spider-Man in 3 movies over 5 years. Whatever the reason, Maguire can't seem to get through filming close-up coverage on what's supposed to be a simple exchange in which Gwen introduces herself to the Daily Bugle photographer.
We got it under control.
Hi, Peter.
Hi.
Was it the blonde wig? Spider-Man's web swinging is a special effect achieved with some combination of green screen, CGI, and actors suspended from gravity-defying wires. Being harnessed up like that is not exactly a natural or comfortable state. It takes a lot of effort to get used to, let alone do a good job of acting in that condition. On the set of Spider-Man Homecoming, Tom Holland couldn't seem to get the hang of those dangling wires. He tries to turn his inability to navigate the wires into a little dance in front of his concerned co-star Donald Glover.
Whoa. Hey, are you alright, man?
In more wire-based shenanigans, while shooting a night scene for Spider-Man 3, Tobey Maguire guides Kirsten Dunst down to the safety of the ground, while notably not wearing a Spidey suit. Dunst has so much fun with the descent that she lets out a couple of hoots, which seemingly causes Maguire to forget his line. He improvises some silliness instead.
Let's go get on my bike.
Okay.
In Avengers Infinity War, when Thanos snaps half the universe to death, Spider-Man falls into the arms of his mentor Tony Stark before turning to dust.
I don't want to go. I don't want to go, sir. Please. Please, I don't want to go. I don't want to go.
It's heartbreaking, which means Holland probably wanted to keep things light and bouncy when his character miraculously returns in Avengers Endgame. In fact, the actor literally bounces around the rubble-strewn set, much to the pleasure of Downey Jr., who hugs the boy wonder for just a little too long, and even plants a kiss on his cheek. Welcome back, Wallcrawler.
Since his debut in 1962, Spider-Man has been one of the most popular superheroes in the world, and he's also one of the most well-known. But with countless Spider-Man stories built around some pretty confusing plot points, it's easy to get mixed up. Let us have the great responsibility of clearing up a lot of incorrect things people believe about Spider-Man. Of all the original Marvel Universe titles, The Amazing Spider-Man is one of the most strongly identified with Stan the Man Lee, even though he'd be a part of all of Marvel's early string of hits, including the Avengers, the X-Men, the Hulk, and more. Spidey was the character he stuck with the longest, scripting the first 100 issues and then staying on sporadically for another few years after.
You know, I guess one person can make a difference. Enough said.
If, however, you think Stan's the only one responsible for the thrills of those early adventures, you're mistaken. Most fans are aware that Lee pioneered the Marvel style of writing, in which he'd collaborate with an artist on a loose plot, then add in the dialogue after everything else was done. What's a little less well known, however, is that his relationship with artist and Spider-Man's co-creator Steve Ditko was one of the first to deteriorate. According to Marvel Comics' The Untold Story, the latter chunk of Ditko's 38-issue run, including the legendary story that gave the world the iconic image of Spider-Man fighting his way out from under a massive heap of rubble, was produced without Ditko and Lee speaking to each other at all.
Of course, that doesn't mean lean wasn't a necessary ingredient for Spider-Man's early success. The fact that he stayed with the character for almost 7 years after Ditko's departure and kept on producing some of the best years of Spider-Man is a testament to how important he was to the character, and how well he got along with Ditko's replacement, Jazzy John Romita. The one thing about Spider-Man that's always been true is that underneath that mask, it's always Peter Parker. Just an average, everyday scientific super genius with problems just like ours. You know, like juggling our long-term relationships to supermodels while making a living off selfies. That's why it's always been Peter, except for all those times it's someone else. While Peter Parker has certainly been the main man in the mask as Spider-Man since Spidey's debut in 1962, he's definitely not the only one. For a while in the 90s, Spider-Man was instead Ben Reilly, a clone of Peter made by a villain called the Jackal. Right around the time Peter temporarily lost his powers, Reilly was tricked into thinking he was the genuine article. He dyed his hair blonde, got a job at a coffee shop, and took over the role with a new costume for the entirety of 1996 before eventually dissolving into a pile of dust. More recently, Peter found his own consciousness overwritten by Dr. Octopus, who took over his life as the superior Spider-Man, beyond just variations on Peter Parker's body, and enough alternate universe versions that they have their own special team. There's an entirely different Spider-Man in the Marvel Universe, Miles Morales, who stepped into the spotlight in 2018's Into the Spider-Verse, a movie based entirely on teaching us that anyone could be Spider-Man if they never give up, including Gwen Stacy, Nick Cage, and a talking pig.
It can get weirder.
One of the most intense arguments you could overhear in a comic book store back when the first Spider-Man movie came out concerned whether Spider-Man's web shooters were mechanical or an organic byproduct of his spider powers. Going by the comics though, it doesn't matter what side of the argument you're on, you're wrong either way. When Sam Raimi's film hit theaters, one of the few notable changes that it made to Spider-Man's origin story came with the addition of organic web shooters. This proved to be so controversial that when the next movies were announced in 2010, the decision to use the comic's mechanical web shooters literally made headlines. After all, he'd never had organic web shooters in the comics, or at least he didn't have them in the comics before those movies came out. After their success, a 2005 storyline called The Other ended with Peter being eaten by a giant spider and emerging with organic webs. Those didn't last either. They inexplicably disappeared with the back-to-basics approach of the Brand New Day story 2 years later, but other Marvel Universe spider characters retained them. In fact, Cindy Moon, a classmate of Peter's who was bitten by the same radioactive spider, is so capable of spinning her own webs that her superheroic codename became Silk. One of the defining tragedies of Spider-Man's life was the death of Gwen Stacy. In the 60s, she was the love of Peter Parker's life, forming a complicated love triangle with Mary Jane Watson and providing the backbone of the soap opera that underscored his Spidey superheroics. In Amazing Spider-Man number 121, the Green Goblin kidnapped her and used her as bait to lure Spider-Man into a battle at the top of the George Washington Bridge. And while the story title wasn't revealed until the last page, the night Gwen Stacy died lived up to its name. The Goblin is definitely to blame for Gwen's murder. He's the one who took her to the top of the bridge and the one who threw her off, all in an effort to torture Spider-Man. If, however, you really want to get technical about things, he's not the one responsible for what literally killed her. That sad honor goes to Spider-Man himself. It's easy to miss, but the real tragedy can be seen in the issue. When Spider-Man tried to save Gwen by snagging her leg with a web line as she plunged toward the Hudson River, the sudden stop proved to be the fatal moment. A small snap sound effect next to Gwen shows it was a broken neck from Peter's attempt at saving her that actually ended Gwen's life. Spider-Man doesn't kill. It's one of the absolute rules of the character, and unlike other heroes, he's lived up to it too. In over 50 years of comics, Spider-Man has never actually killed anyone himself, except for the one time he did. It happened in the pages of Spider-Man vs. Wolverine, a 1987 one-shot by Christopher Priest and Mark Bright that pulled Spidey into a dark world of international espionage. The conflict between the two title characters is largely built around a spy codenamed Charlemagne, who is described as Wolverine's best friend from his days as a government operative. In this story, Charlie wants Wolverine to kill her so she won't be apprehended and spend the rest of her life being tortured in a gulag. When Spider-Man stumbles into this situation, all he knows is Wolverine is trying to kill someone. In the fight that ensues, Spidey unleashes his full strength on the X-Man, hitting him with blows that would wreck cars. Sadly, Charlie takes advantage of the brutal conflict, tricking Spider-Man into hitting her instead of Wolverine, using him to commit suicide. Peter was understandably traumatized by the event, and while he and Wolverine have made peace in the years since, it was a source of bitterness between them for a long time. The iconic image of Peter Parker is of a young man struggling to make ends meet by working as a freelance photographer, selling snapshots of his own superheroic exploits to the Daily Bugle to satisfy J. Jonah Jameson's demand for pictures of Spider-Man. If that's your only concept of what Spidey does when he's not out fighting crime, however, it's time for an update. The truth is, while Peter worked for the Bugle for decades in a lot of classic stories, he hasn't actually been a freelance photographer for most of this century. Starting in 2001, Pete returned to his old stomping grounds of Midtown High as a science teacher, but that proved to be a pretty short-lived career choice. In the years since, he's had a couple of science-related jobs working for a think tank called Horizon Labs, where he reverse-engineered his crime-fighting gadgets into consumer goods. He even founded his own multinational corporation called Parker Industries, although technically it was Otto Octavius who founded that company while he was in Peter's body, and Peter had to destroy it to keep it from being taken over by Nazis. Comics are complicated. One of the more controversial moments in Spider-Man's comics history involved a deal with the devil, like the literal devil, not just this guy.
Finish it!
After Peter revealed his identity during the events of Civil War, his family was targeted by bad guys who nearly killed Aunt May, which was a good reminder of why he had the whole secret identity thing to begin with. Unfortunately for the Parker family, that sort of reveal isn't the kind of thing you can undo, unless you're willing to make an infernal bargain with Mephisto, which is exactly what happened. Rather than selling their souls, however, Peter and then-wife Mary Jane Watson sold their marriage, effectively erasing their years of wedded bliss from Marvel Comics continuity as though it had never happened. In the Spider-Man comics, Peter and MJ were both freed up to pursue new relationships, but don't let that fool you into thinking the marriage is completely gone. In order to go along with the comic book storyline, the Spider-Man newspaper strip did away with the marriage as well. Readers reacted so poorly, however, that in the strip that ran on May 24, 2009, the elimination of the marriage was revealed to have been a dream. Ever since, newspaper Spidey has remained happily married, or at least as happy as anyone can be when they spend most of their time getting knocked unconscious right next to Dilbert. Everyone knows that Peter Parker was orphaned at a young age and raised by Aunt May and Uncle Ben. Considering that his surrogate parents were about as wholesome and salt of the earth as people could be, it stands to reason that Richard and Mary Parker were cut from the same cloth. Just average ordinary folks, right? Wrong. In 1968, it was revealed that when the Parker parents died, they were under a cloud of suspicion as traitors to their country. The truth, however, was that they were spies working for S.H.I.E.L.D., who had infiltrated the Red Skull's criminal organization before being killed, without ever getting the chance to clear their names. Yes, in case you missed that, Spider-Man's parents were spies who were murdered by Captain America's arch-nemesis. If that's not weird enough, they later turned up alive, only to be revealed even later to be robot duplicates. That's not the end of the Parker family's secrets, though. It turns out that in addition to the parents he never knew, Spidey also had a long-lost older sister, Teresa, who was herself a S.H.I.E.L.D. agent. After a team-up in which it was revealed that her memories of the Parkers were falsely implanted by Mephisto, it turned out that was also a ruse. She was in fact Peter's actual sister after all, and even pitched in to help him fight bad guys using her spy skills. If you've ever read any Spider-Man comic, or seen him in a movie or a cartoon, or encountered the character pretty much anywhere, then you've almost certainly seen the motto that guides his life.
Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
Except Ben Parker never actually said those words. In Amazing Fantasy number 15, Spidey's often referenced motto is never spoken out loud by any character, not even Uncle Ben. Instead, it only appears in a caption at the end of the story as a moral lesson imparted by, well, Stan Lee. Spidey himself doesn't even say it until 25 years later in 1987. As time went on, though, the phrase became more and more identified with Ben, largely because it would be really weird for Spider-Man to solemnly vow to accept the lesson that was imparted to him through narration by the guy who wrote his comics.
Spider-Man has faced nearly every member of his rogues gallery during his cinematic adventures, but there are still a few villains who have yet to make their silver screen debut. From killer goblins to monstrous vampires to, swarms of bees, these are a few of those villains. Kraven the Hunter is by far the most infamous Spider-Man villain to have never featured in a live-action movie. Otherwise known as Sergei Kravenov, this obsessive big-game hunter first appeared all the way back in 1964's Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1, number 15. In this story, Kraven is hired by his friend Chameleon to bring down Spider-Man. Inevitably, the hunter quickly becomes the prey, and Spider-Man has Kraven both arrested and deported. This would mark the beginning of a long and storied criminal career for Sergei Kravenov, who has devoted his entire existence to besting Spider-Man once and for all. Considering Kraven is such a prominent member of Spider-Man's rogues gallery, it'll come as no surprise to find that fans have been clamoring for him to show up on screen for many years. And he's come pretty close, too. In 2021, Tom Holland even told Collider that Spider-Man No Way Home director John Watts originally intended for the third MCU Spidey movie to feature Kraven as the main antagonist. And now it seems that Kraven is finally about to step into the spotlight. A solo film set within Sony's Spider-Man universe has been on the cards for a while now, and in 2021, Deadline reported that Avengers Age of Ultron star Aaron Taylor Johnson had been cast as the notorious Hunter himself.
You didn't see that coming?
Should all go to plan, Kraven the Hunter will land in theaters on January 13th, 2023. Goblin villains will be very familiar to fans of the Spider-Man movies. Willem Dafoe made comic book movie history as Norman Osborn's Green Goblin in the original Spider-Man, while James Franco played Harry Osborn in Sam Raimi's trilogy, taking the mantle of New Goblin in Spider-Man 3. Similarly, Dane DeHaan played a goblin-crazed Harry Osborn in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. In the comics, however, there are far more goblins than the Green Goblin, and many more people have taken the mantle than Norman and Harry Osborn. Perhaps the second most well-known of these is the villain known as the Hobgoblin. 6 people have operated under that name over the years, but the deadliest of all is Roderick Kingsley. Debuting as the masked villain in 1983's Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1, number 238, Kingsley is a billionaire fashion designer who enters the criminal underworld after acquiring and altering Norman Osborn's Goblin formula. It's probably fair to say that audiences are probably over the Green Goblin by now, despite Willem Dafoe's dramatic return in Spider-Man No Way Home. Nevertheless, the Hobgoblin's movie debut could provide a refreshing twist on a fan-favorite villain. Otherwise known as the Spot, Jonathan Owen first appeared in 1985's Peter Parker, The Spectacular Spider-Man Volume 1, number 98. A scientist in the employ of Kingpin, Owen creates a strange black portal while attempting to recreate the powers of the vigilante hero, Cloak. It soon becomes clear that Owen has gained the ability to open these portals and traverse physical space via the so-called Spot World. Owen subsequently names himself the Spot and embarks upon a criminal career. The Spot's unique costume and strange abilities make him a more visually arresting villain than most. Suitably, he's featured in a number of stories beyond the comic book universe, including Spider-Man the Animated Series and the 2017 Spider-Man show. It's possible he'll be popping up on the silver screen sometime soon, too, as, according to Murphy's Multiverse, the Spot could be a key baddie in the upcoming animated sequel, Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse.
This could literally not get any weirder.
Since the comic book version of Owen is a close ally of Kingpin, who was the main antagonist in Into the Spider-Verse, it's easy to see how he might fit into Miles Morales' story, and how the Spot's interdimensional powers could provide an intriguing slant on the original movie's multiversal antics. The Inheritors are a team of supervillains best known for their role in the original Spider-Verse story arc and its follow-up, Spider-Geddon. Each member of this clan of totem-hunting vampires has dedicated their life to hunting down spider people across the multiverse and consuming their essences. A number of Inheritors have battled Spider-Man and his other selves, but the two most prominent are Morlun and Karn. Morlun is arguably the deadliest and scariest member of the Inheritors, having killed and consumed a whole heap of spider people during his so-called Great Hunt. Karn, meanwhile, is living in exile during his first appearance. After he hesitated on a mission to capture the Master Weaver, who controls the all-powerful web of life and destiny, Karn's mother was struck down and killed. As a result, Karn was exiled until he could prove his return, a task he attempts to accomplish throughout the first Spider-Verse storyline. As the main antagonists of the comic book version of Spider-Verse, it seems strange that the Inheritors had nothing to do with Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Still, with 2 follow-ups planned for that movie, who knows what the future has in store for these dimension-hopping ghouls. Silver Sable is one of those Spider-Man characters who can act as an ally or an enemy of the Wallcrawler, depending on what each story requires. Born Sylvia Sablinova, this highly skilled mercenary was introduced in 1985's Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1, number 265, in which she leads the vigilante team of soldiers known as the Wild Pack. Although she has collaborated with a number of superheroes over the years, including Spider-Man, Silver Sable has still played the role of antagonist every now and then. Although Sablinova has yet to star in a Spider-Man movie, the character was once destined for the big screen. In 2017, Sony announced that production had begun on Silver and Black, a feature film following the adventures of Sable and Black Cat, another morally ambiguous Spider-Man friend and foe. Sadly, the project wasn't destined to last, and director Gina Prince Bythewood eventually revealed that Sony were considering offering the story to Disney+, having previously decided to give each character their own movie project. A few months later, Prince Bythewood told Looper that she'd been preoccupied with her work on the Netflix movie The Old Guard, but that she was planning to re-engage with the Silver Sable and Black Cat project at some point. Still, Marvel fans shouldn't expect to see Sable gracing the silver screen in the near future. The villain, known as Mr. Negative, is a more recent addition to Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery, first hitting the page in 2007's Free Comic Book Day, The Amazing Spider-Man. His true name isn't known, but the man who became Mr. Negative was once a Chinese gangster, captured by the crime boss Silvermane and forced to undergo an experimental drug procedure. This process gave him control over the Light Force and Dark Force, 2 forms of extra-dimensional energy that are more commonly wielded by mutants and magic users. The experiment also split the gangster's mind into 2, forming the Martin Lee persona, a philanthropist who works with the homeless, as well as Mr. Negative himself, the evil crime lord at the head of the Inner Demons street gang. Mr. Negative has played a prominent role in Spider-Man's stories in recent years, but one of his most famous occurs in the Marvel's Spider-Man video game, in which he wages a war against Kingpin and Norman Osborn for control of New York.
What are you doing to me? Giving you a new perspective.
Obviously, Mr. Negative isn't exactly a stalwart of the live-action Spider-Man movies, but his homeless charity Feast appears in Spider-Man No Way Home, so never say never. Despite being nowhere near as well known as Spider-Man's A-list villains, the Jackal is actually one of Peter Parker's oldest foes. In 1965, The Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1, number 31, introduced readers to Miles Warren, a professor at Empire State University who develops a desperate infatuation with the student, Gwen Stacy. After Stacy is killed by the Green Goblin, Warren blames Spider-Man for her death, adopting the Jackal alter ego in order to get his revenge. The Jackal's true identity was actually something of a twist in the original comic books. His villainous persona didn't emerge until 1974's The Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1, number 129, with his true identity revealed a year later in number 148. In subsequent years, the Jackal has fought Spider-Man on a number of occasions, but his most notable contribution is the creation of clone copies of Spider-Man, such as Ben Reilly, who eventually became the Jackal himself. As such, the Jackal has taken on a starring role in some of Spider-Man's most famous and infamous storylines, including the Clone Saga and Spider Island. Here's a pitch for you. An Australian with a knack for hurling boomerangs dons a goofy costume and turns to a life of crime, joining up with several supervillain teams in the process. Think you've heard this one before? Well, this isn't actually the origin of DC's Captain Boomerang, or at least it's not just the origin of DC's Captain Boomerang. This is the story of Frederick Myers, aka Boomerang. DC's take on a boomerang-wielding criminal preceded Marvel's by 6 years, with the latter hitting the scene in 1966's Tales to Astonish Volume 1, number 81. And it's also probably fair to say that Marvel's Boomerang is far less renowned than his distinguished competitor. Myers is an ex-professional baseball player, known for his strong pitching arm, who was drafted into the employ of the Hydra-adjacent group known as the Secret Empire. His new taskmasters outfitted him with special weapons and conferred upon him the codename Boomerang, more as a joke than anything else. After the end of the Empire, Myers decides to become a freelance assassin, and in this role, he has joined the ranks of pretty much every team of supervillains to have ever existed. Sadly, considering DC's Captain Boomerang has recently been adapted into live action for both Suicide Squad movies, it doesn't seem likely that Marvel will be trying out their own Boomerang anytime soon. Let's just get one thing clear here. Yes, this is absolutely a man made of bees. Better known under the pseudonym Swarm, Fritz von Meyer was a Nazi scientist who stumbled across a colony of mutant bees after the end of World War II. Von Meyer attempted and failed to control these bees, who consumed him alive and absorbed him into their hive mind. This not only merged their consciousnesses, but also gave him the ability to control them at will. All of this is explained in Champions Volume 1, Number 15, a story in which Swarm takes on a team of heroes including Angel, Black Widow, Ghost Rider, Hercules, Iceman, and Darkstar. Since then, however, Von Meyer and his bothersome bees have become a stalwart enemy of Spider-Man. More recently, in Ant-Man Volume 2, he has teamed up with Scott Lang to take down the Bug Lords, who are exactly what they sound like. As you might have guessed, Swarm isn't exactly the most serious comic book villain out there. Indeed, his latest stories have been a lot of fun, often leaning into the character's arch silliness. If ever a future Spider-Man movie needed a colorful and amusing secondary antagonist to stir up trouble on the side, Swarm would be just the horrific mass of bees for the job. Jackson Wheel, aka Big Wheel, is one of Spider-Man's weirdest foes. First appearing in 1978's The Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1, Number 182, Wheel is a corrupt businessman who hires the villainous engineer known as the Tinkerer to create a massive, deadly monowheel that will help him to defeat his rival, Rocket Racer. Their feud soon brings the Big Wheel into the path of Spider-Man, sparking a rivalry that would last, well, not very long at all. Wheel actually disappears at the end of the very next issue and has only returned a few times, mostly as a joke character. He has also dabbled in superheroics every now and again, and even his more recent acts of mischief have been half-hearted at best. Big Wheel has yet to turn up in a live-action adaptation of Spider-Man's adventures, which you probably knew already, because who wouldn't have remembered Andrew Garfield fleeing a huge wheel in The Amazing Spider-Man 2? Still, it's probably fair to say that this guy needs to join the MCU ASAP. Cast some highly prestigious A-list actor, throw him into battle against Peter Parker, and watch those box office numbers soar.
Just because Peter Parker's Aunt May is getting on a bit doesn't mean she's boring. In fact, there's much more to May than just a mean batch of wheat cakes. From her humble beginnings to her big screen debut and everything in between, here's the untold story of Marvel's most iconic golden oldie. Officially, May and Ben Parker made their canonical debut alongside Spider-Man in Amazing Fantasy number 15. But Spider-Man's origin story wasn't the first time that the characters had graced the pages of a Marvel comic. A couple of months before Spider-Man's big entrance, Stan Lee and Steve Ditko published a short story called Goodbye to Linda Brown in Strange Tales number 97, which featured early versions of both of Peter's relatives. Goodbye to Linda Brown is only a few pages long and doesn't leave much room for character development. But both Ben and May show glimmers of their future selves. For one, they look very similar to their Amazing Fantasy counterparts, especially May. For some reason, the colorist decided to give Ben a gray mustache, although Ditko clearly didn't pencil one in. In addition, both characters spend most of their time fretting over a teenager with secret superpowers, which is pretty much all Aunt May did for the first 50 issues or so of The Amazing Spider-Man. Luckily, things did get a little more interesting after that. Most fans probably saw Aunt May in the flesh for the first time in Sam Raimi's 2002 Spider-Man movie, in which Peter Parker's doddering aunt was played by Emmy-winning actress Rosemary Harris. But Harris wasn't actually the first person to bring May to life in a live-action project. That honor goes to Jeff Donnell, and so we're clear, Jean Marie Donnell went by her nickname Jeff, so that explains that. Anyway, she portrayed Aunt May in a 90-minute TV movie that served as the backdoor pilot for the 1977 Spider-Man television series. Donnell only played Aunt May in the Spider-Man pilot. For May's later appearances, the role was assumed by a number of different actresses, including reoccurring Dennis the Menace star Irene Tedrow. And of course, many actresses tackled the role of Aunt May in the world of animation before Harris immortalized her on the big screen. June Foray voiced May in Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, in which Spidey and Company operated out of May's Queens-based abode. But you probably know Foray better as the original voices of both Rocky the Flying Squirrel and his arch-nemesis Natasha Fatal. In terms of early Spider-Man stories, you won't find much that's more iconic than The Amazing Spider-Man number 33. This comic, titled The Final Chapter, isn't actually co-creator Steve Ditko's final pass at Spider-Man, but it does feel like an end of an era, and it puts Aunt May front and center of the story. As the issue opens, Aunt May lies on a hospital bed, dying from a transfusion of Peter Parker's radioactive blood. The only cure is an isotope known as ISO-36, which is contained in an underwater lab controlled by Spider-Man's arch-nemesis, Dr. Octopus. The two fight and destroy the lab, and as it fills with water, Spider-Man is pinned underneath multiple tons of fallen steel, with no hope of escape. The following 4 pages are arguably Ditko's finest work in any Spider-Man comic. At least, that's what Stan Lee thinks. Lee later said, "It was one of my all-time favorite stories. It was such a thrill, even to me, and I was the writer of the story. When I saw that, I almost shouted in triumph. Steve did a wonderful job." And who does Peter have to thank for his big moment? Well, Ditko, of course, but also Aunt May. As the water rises, Spider-Man thinks about his beloved aunt and how he's failed her in the past, namely by letting an anonymous robber get away, leaving him free to kill her husband, Ben. Using May's strength and resilience as motivation, Peter lifts the steel beams above his head and escapes. He delivers the isotope to the hospital in the nick of time and, with May cured, puts the specter of Uncle Ben's death behind him once and for all. The scene is so iconic that it plays out on the big screen too, in Spider-Man Homecoming. The Amazing Spider-Man number 121, in which the Green Goblin kills Peter Parker's girlfriend Gwen Stacy, is arguably one of the most important and notorious superhero comics ever published, but it almost played out very, very differently. Originally, Gwen Stacy was going to make it to the end of the issue alive and well, while Aunt May was to meet her demise at the Goblin's hands instead. That revelation comes from none other than longtime Spider-Man artist John Romita Sr., who co-plotted the issue with writer Jerry Conway. While talking to CBR, Romita confessed that he, and not Conway or artist Gil Kane, was Gwen Stacy's real murderer. The original plan was to sacrifice Aunt May to the Green Goblin, but Romita pushed back on the idea, claiming that it would actually make The Amazing Spider-Man less dramatic. Romita explained, "It'll lose one of Peter Parker's hang-ups. He won't have to worry about Aunt May anymore. He won't be treated like a child anymore. If we want to make any kind of stir in the monthly line, we have to kill somebody important." And so, Romita explained, the victim had to be one of the story's leading female figures. From there, Gwen Stacy became the obvious choice. At the time, Mary Jane was what Romita called an airhead comedy character, but Gwen Stacy was the love of Peter Parker's life. In order to wring the maximum amount of emotional turmoil out of the story, Gwen had to go. And the rest, of course, is history. Aunt May's abilities aren't limited to simply fretting about the well-being of superheroes, though. In fact, she's also a superhero herself. Sort of. In What If number 23, a backup feature called What If Aunt May, instead of her nephew Peter, had been bitten by that radioactive spider, tells the story of, well, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? In Amazing Fantasy number 15, Peter attends a scientific demonstration where he crosses paths with the fateful radioactive spider. In What If number 23, he leaves his bagged lunch at home, and Aunt May rushes to the Science Institute to deliver it. While she's there, the spider bites May on the hand, and her spider powers kick in on the walk home. May quickly sews herself a costume and creates a unique version of Spider-Man's web fluid out of some over-yeasted dough. Before long, she's taken to the streets as Spider-Man, juggling her crime-fighting career with her familial responsibilities. And while What If stories aren't canonical, writer Christos Gage and artist Dave Williams made Spider-Man a reality in Spider-Man Team-Up number 3, part of Dan Slott and Olivier Coipel's dimension-hopping epic Spider-Verse. In the comic, a team of Spider-Men, including the Peter Parker we know and love, travel to Earth 3123 to rescue Spider-Man from Karn, an interdimensional hunter with a mad hatred for everything spider-related. The team is successful, but the battle leads to a dramatic development in Spider-Man's story. She finally reveals her secret identity to her husband and nephew, whose lives are changed forever. The list of people who have stopped Galactus, Marvel Comics' gargantuan devourer of worlds, is pretty short. The Fantastic Four have done it, of course. So have Thanos, the Silver Surfer, and the Beyonder. And Aunt May. Wait, what? This tale took place in Marvel Team-Up number 137, which was part of Marvel's Assistant Editors Month, an event during which some of Marvel's top creators were given free rein to tell the wildest and silliest stories they could imagine. In the comic, Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four head off to San Diego to thwart an unnamed disaster, leaving Reed Richards and Sue Storm's superpowered son Franklin in Aunt May's care. Unfortunately, just after the real heroes leave town, Galactus arrives in search of a new herald, and he's got his sights set on Franklin. One ill-aimed energy blast later, and Aunt May is transformed into the Golden Oldie, a glowing superheroine infused with the power cosmic.
I believe there's a hero in all of us that keeps us honest, gives us strength.
Thanks to Galactus, all of Aunt May's health problems, her arthritis, her vitamin deficiencies, her bingo addiction are gone. But there's a catch. Galactus is hungry, and it's up to his herald to keep him fed. At Franklin's prompting, May feeds Galactus a Twinkie. He loves it and demands more. Using her newfound powers, May scours first Earth, then the entire galaxy for more of the spongy, cream-filled snack cakes. On her travels, she meets an alien that looks suspiciously like the Pillsbury Doughboy, who just happens to make planets that resemble Hostess products. At May's suggestion, Galactus takes the alien on as his new herald and frees May from her responsibilities. When she returns home, Franklin absorbs all of May's cosmic powers, and everything goes back to normal. Right before writer Michael Carlin reveals that the whole adventure was just a bad dream. Or was it? Peter Parker will always be the main man in May Parker's life, but with such a busy day-to-day life, May's nephew doesn't always have time for his beleaguered aunt. Thankfully, despite her age, May is incredibly popular with the fellows, and has accumulated quite a collection of dudes to keep her company while Peter's away. There was Ben Parker, of course, who met his tragic demise in Amazing Fantasy number 15. But before Ben and May got hitched, she almost married a criminal named Johnny Jerome, who tried to win her heart with money and who returned to plague her in the Spectacular Spider-Man Annual number 4. In the Amazing Spider-Man number 54, Dr. Octopus rents May's spare room and wins her over with his charms. And in the Amazing Spider-Man number 131, he actually tries to marry her in order to steal her inheritance, although Hammerhead and Spider-Man interrupt the wedding before it becomes official.
Cute place. Real homey.
Oh, great. It's Liv.
Throughout the 80s, May dated Nathan Lubensky, a reformed gambling addict who asked May to marry him before he relapsed, fell afoul of the Vulture, and died in Amazing Spider-Man number 336. In the early 90s, she enjoyed a brief fling with the Fantastic Four's longtime mailman, Willie Lumpkin. After Peter Parker and Aunt May moved to Stark Tower in the build-up to Civil War, May and Tony Stark's butler, Jarvis, shared a mutual attraction. Finally, May dated and married J. Jonah Jameson's father, John Jameson Sr., and stayed with him until he died of a rare hereditary disease in the Amazing Spider-Man Volume 4, number 19. Aunt May actress Rosemary Harris was 75 in 2002 when Sam Raimi's Spider-Man hit theaters. When she appeared as May in The Amazing Spider-Man, Sally Field was 66. By contrast, Marissa Tomei, who plays May in the modern MCU, was only 50 when she first starred as Peter Parker's favorite aunt. That's significantly younger than May is usually portrayed. In Civil War, Tony Stark even jokes about it.
Who else knows? Anybody?
Nobody.
Not even your unusually attractive aunt?
No.
But don't blame Tomei. While appearing on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, Tomei revealed that she actually petitioned Marvel to make May into a senior citizen, just like in the comics, but the studio declined.
I actually made a case to go with to age me up, but no, they didn't do it.
Besides, as Civil War co-writer Stephen McFeely has explained, a younger Aunt May makes perfect sense, given that Tom Holland's Peter Parker is still in high school. McFeely told the Los Angeles Times that's partly why his aunt isn't 80 years old. If she's the sister of his dead mother, why does she have to be 2 generations ahead? In other words, the MCU's Aunt May isn't too young at all. In the comics, she's actually way too old.
He's brave. He's relatable. He's funny. He's friendly, spectacular, and amazing. But Spider-Man can also be unprofessional. And maybe a little pervy. If you want to keep your childhood memories of Spidey intact, bail out now. But if you want to see Spider-Man for who he really is, warts and all, be warned. Without the veneer of nostalgia, you might not like what you see. Fake news. Peter Parker, through his work with the Daily Bugle, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning photojournalist, and that means he's expected to adhere to certain ethical standards. He doesn't. In fact, his entire career is pretty much a lie. While Peter tells J. Jonah Jameson that his photos of Spider-Man swinging through the city are candid, he often stages shots in order to get the best angle. In reality, he's shooting selfies and selling them as news. He creates newsworthy events and then uses them to his financial advantage, which is borderline evil. Peter's transgressions are serious enough that he could be legally liable for misrepresentation, fraud, and breach of contract, and he wouldn't have much of a defense to fall back on. In other words, Peter Parker is a hack who shouldn't be allowed anywhere near a camera and should never be trusted with the news. And speaking of cameras, Mary Jane's indiscretions. It's not just fake news that Peter's cameras get used for. He also spends a lot of time focusing on his wife, mostly when she's naked, which you may not completely realize as a kid. In Spectacular Spider-Man number 134, Mary Jane takes some sexy shots to convince Peter to become a fashion photographer, while Peter crawls on the wall and pulls her to the ceiling for some adult recreation. In The Amazing Spider-Man number 300, Peter and MJ break into their new apartment and relieve some venom-induced stress by taking some snaps for their private collection. In the sensational Spider-Man number 20, Peter takes his mind off a string of recent failures by putting his photographic talents to use in the bedroom. We just can't figure out why Mary Jane would be so eager to jump back in front of the camera during her time off from being a model. Get a hobby, lady. Spider nonsense. Peter Parker was given spider-like powers by a radioactive spider bite, and for the most part, it checks out. Clinging to walls? Sure. Super strength? Absolutely. Jumping extra high? According to science, Spider-Man doesn't even jump high enough. So, where the heck did his famous spider sense powers come from? Spiders can sense movement in the air around them using small hairs on their bodies, and they can track the vibrations in their webs to tell different types of insects apart. That means that Spider-Man should be able to identify nearby physical threats, but his spider sense does much, much more than that.
My spider senses are starting to tingle.
It tells Peter when an enemy is in disguise, or if someone is lying. It guides him to hidden threats. It picks up specific radio frequencies, which is how spider tracers work. Spider sense is less of a biological function and more of a psychic power, and it's not anything like a real spider's abilities, not even close. With great power...
Remember, with great power comes great responsibility.
Except that's not actually how it goes. In Amazing Fantasy number 15, the actual quote reads, "With great power there must also come great responsibility." That doesn't flow off the tongue quite as well as the abbreviated version, so it makes sense that future writers would try to condense it a little bit. It's also a quote commonly attributed to Uncle Ben, but Ben never actually says those words in Amazing Fantasy number 15, Spidey's first appearance. During Spider-Man's origin story, Uncle Ben only has 2 lines. He wakes up Peter for school and comments on how Peter is getting too big to out-wrestle thanks to Aunt May's fat-filled wheat cakes. The quote by which Spider-Man lives his life is only spoken by an unnamed narrator, who utters the line as Spider-Man tearfully wanders off into the night, still mourning his uncle's death. "Your whole life is a lie, Spider-Man." Jokes on Carnage. Carnage might be the coolest Spider-Man villain ever. He's like Venom, but faster, stronger, and looks like he's made of meat. He's more than a match for most Marvel heroes. He has complete control over his symbiotes and eats other symbiotes in order to boost his strength. What more could you want in a bad guy? Well, how about some originality? For starters, he's basically a supersized version of Venom, who's already basically just Spider-Man, but evil. The ripoff report is only getting started though. In his civilian identity of Cletus Cassidy, he closely resembles yet another famous character. If the maniacal grin, sharp cheekbones, and the psychotic disregard for human life remind you of a clown-themed villain, you're not alone. In 2007, Carnage co-creator Eric Larson flat out admitted that Cletus Cassidy is a straight-up Joker knockoff, saying, "He was inspired by the Joker. I basically drew the Joker and had him colored with regular skin and red hair." Larson isn't the only one who thought Joker and Carnage shared some strong similarities either. In 1995, the Spider-Man and Batman crossover comic saw the Clown Prince of Crime team up with the symbiotes to wreak havoc in Gotham City, bringing the Sinister Twins together at last. Spider-Man's terrible friends. Many heroes have personal ties to their arch-nemeses, but Spider-Man takes things to a whole new level. Basically, anyone in Peter Parker's life who isn't dead turns into a supervillain sooner or later. No, seriously. There's Norman Osborn, of course, who happens to be both his best friend's dad and the evil Green Goblin. Once Norman's out of the picture, his son Harry picks up the pumpkin bombs and carries on with the family legacy. The clone-obsessed Jackal is Peter's college professor, Miles Warren. The Molten Man is the stepbrother of Peter's high school crush, Liz Allen. Man-Wolf is Peter's boss's son, while J. Jonah Jameson himself funded the creation of the Spider Slayers, as well as the villainous Scorpion. Ned Leeds, one of Peter's co-workers at the Daily Bugle, spent some time as the Hobgoblin, just for fun. And those are just the classics. More recently, a good friend of Aunt May's, the philanthropist Martin Lee, turned out to be the evil Mr. Negative. Harry Osborn's fiancée, Lily Hollister, reveals herself as the goblin-themed villain Menace. And Phil Urich, nephew of Peter's Daily Bugle pal Ben Urich, decided to terrorize the city as yet another hobgoblin. They say you can't choose your family, but you can choose your friends. If that's really true, Peter, choose better. These people suck.